A nurse blew a big deal to a rich man by overhearing his wife talking to her lover, and by breaking the pact. After her husband left the family, Emily was left alone with 2 young children. Frankly, it was a blow, a shock. She had never imagined that there was anything wrong with their family. On the contrary, they seemed happy. And then the woman had a harsh confrontation with reality. Her husband Andrew did not even find the strength to explain himself to her, to talk, to clarify the situation. No, he acted like a coward, like a complete scoundrel. He left quietly, wrote a tiny note, and ran away. In fact, silently packed up all his things and left the flat while Emily and the kids were at the clinic. But who does that? Is that dignified? Is that what you expect from the man you lived under the same roof with, had children with? And this note. Emily will never forget this concision from her ex-husband. I can't take it anymore. I'm leaving simply and clearly, so that the woman did not build vain illusions. It was incredibly, simply unbearably painful. Emily couldn't get it into her head. How could he do this to her, to the children? Of course, she rushed to call, only the caller was no longer available. Andrew hadn't run off in a hurry, silently, to explain himself later. Worse, Andrew didn't just run off into the unknown. He took the family's savings with him, took everything they had. Needless to say, the man did not think to pay child support for his children either. It turned out that the monetary collapse was a much bigger shock than the love betrayal. That pain was only emotional, and in the situation with money, Emily faced complete hopelessness and hopelessness. And it would have been fine if she were alone, but she had children on her hands. They needed to be fed, clothed, and how? The unfortunate woman realized quite quickly that tears could not help her grief. You can sit and feel sorry for yourself endlessly, but this will not bring any changes. Food will not appear in the fridge, and money will not fall on the card. I had to pull myself together and act. Through can't and through don't want to pull herself out of the emotional pit for the sake of the children, for their well-being and happy childhood. Emily couldn't afford to let them down, to betray them as her own father had betrayed her. There were no options. It was necessary to start with the smallest and most obvious. First of all, the young woman decided to move in with her mother in her flat. A small flat in the city, Emily and her mom's inheritance. It could be rented out. There was already some money coming in. In the meantime, she could live in the countryside, in a small village with her retired mom. It's even better for the children. Emily tried to reassure herself. In the air, on natural products. In any case, there were no other options. She couldn't even afford to pay the rent. And to go to work, she had to leave her children on someone. Unfortunately, the queue for kindergarten was still not approaching, and Emily could only dream of hiring a nanny. Now, such a luxury she obviously could not afford. Of course, the village is not a city, but there will be at least some opportunity to work part-time, to put drips, injections. After all, Emily had been a nurse before her maternity leave. It's not ideal. But what is better to stay in the city, and in the near future to go to bread and water, begging? Emily preferred honest labor. That's right, don't be a fool. Mrs. Mia fully supported her daughter's decision. I told you a long time ago that you should move with the children to my place. They'll be at ease here, they'll enjoy the fresh air. There's lots of other kids here. Why bother? There was no other way out anyway. I'm almost out of money. I used the last pennies to pay the rent and bought some minimal groceries. I've already found tenants. Seemed like normal people. I've got my things ready and packed. So there's no turning back, Emily sighed bitterly. The idea of returning to her mother in her native village was not very close to her. What was the point of embarrassing Mrs. Mia, a sick pensioner? She loved her grandchildren, of course, but seeing them occasionally or living and looking after 2 children all the time were different things. I didn't want to impose, to force my mom to solve her problems. Emily was not used to help. She became independent early. So the current circumstances forced the woman to literally overcome her fears and expectations. It's okay, Smith. Everything will be all right, Mrs. Mia rejoiced. You'll see, Mrs. Mia said. Well, it happens. Everyone goes through black and gray streaks in life. Who hasn't been betrayed in this life? You just have to learn from it and move on. Yes, Mum, I understand, Emily replied. I don't have time to be discouraged. As soon as we get here, we'll have to find clients and patients. so that we can make some money on top of the rent. I can't just sit on your back." "Don't worry. I've already told Aunt Amanda. She'll tell everyone you're here and that you need a job. You know how we are with medical care. So I'm sure you'll find someone quickly. It'd be nice if the neighboring village heard about you. People there have good money. They can afford to pay and hire a nurse." "Yes, that would be ideal," Emily said dreamily. Indeed, about 10 years ago, a new township for the rich had sprung up in their neighborhood. Apparently they were attracted by nature, fresh air, a lake nearby. Of course, they needed servants and staff. The rich preferred to hire them in the neighboring villages. You can't travel from the city. 5 kilometers away and you're there. Emily's journey was no more than 3.5 kilometers in a straight line, through a forest path. What are they going to do on a bicycle when there's no snow? So the nurse, of course, hoped that there would be patients for her there too. The well-to-do could afford to pay for medical services. It's always easier to take money from someone who has it. Emily knew that she would still take crumbs from some retired grandmother. She couldn't get over herself. That's her upbringing. So Emily and her children moved to their native land, and at first everything seemed sad, anxious. But in reality, everything appeared in a completely different light. The children, a very tiny 2-year-old Anne and 5-year-old Matthew, took the new home with great enthusiasm. Of course, they were cramped in the flat, but here they have space. Everything is interesting, where now city children could see a real cow, goat, and piglets. All in all, the children were delighted. "Mum, but we'll live here for a while." The son kept pestering his mother. "Yes, we're not going back to town just yet." "No, Matthew, I think we'll stay here for a while," Emily smiled. Her heart rejoiced that the children were happy. Wasn't that the most important thing to a mother? Emily was very worried about her children. Did she have anything more precious than them? So gradually, little by little, life began to get better, to get back on track. There were no more fears, you just had to move forward. Especially since Emily simply had no way out. How could she give up, admit her weakness? Only her husband Andrew was capable of that, but not her. Emily did her best to keep her children happy, to make sure that Matthew and Anne didn't need anything. It's not their fault their mum picked such a lousy father for them, she told herself. It wasn't their fault, and it wasn't their fault, and it wasn't their responsibility. What's more, Mum Mrs. Mia had to be taken care of too. It was only now, living with her under the same roof, that her daughter noticed that she had given up a lot lately. And who would take care of them all but her? Who needs them? So regardless, Emily rolled up her sleeves and got to work. There was a lot of walking, cycling, a lot of socializing with seriously ill people. Of course, it was very exhausting both mentally and physically. But the nurse did not think to complain. Everything was going the way she wanted it to. There are patients who are able to pay for the work the same huge thanks. In such a situation, to grumble and complain is only to anger God. When the first regular clients started to appear, life in general began to shine with new colors. Finally gone that negativity of hopelessness and helplessness. And that was the most important thing. In this rhythm of life, the nurse survived for the 3rd month. Everything suited her. Especially fooled the woman that now was not ashamed to look children in the eyes, not refusing in trifles, for which bail lack of money. One day, Emily cycled to a neighboring village to visit her regular patient, to whom she was giving vitamin drips to maintain her general tone and health. The nurse liked Mrs. Jane very much. She paid well, she could afford it, she joked, she laughed, she didn't look down on the nurse. I've had my share of that. Their relationship was good, even friendly. Emily's mood that day was combative and upbeat. Mrs. Jane offered her a coffee after the drip. She didn't refuse. The women chatted about nothing, about life. Oops. The patient suddenly came to her senses, clearly remembering something. What a crow. I promised to talk to you and it slipped my mind. Emily was very interested. It would be nice if Mrs. Jane could recommend a nurse to some well-to-do neighbor. Something not quite your profile, she said. But she promised to ask. Maybe you'd be interested. We've got the biggest house in the village on Main Street. Do you know it? The nurse nodded patiently. Of course, it was hard to miss. The owners had obviously invested a great deal in the house, in its decoration. It was clear and visible to the naked eye. The high fence, designed to hide the splendor, only attracted the attention of the curious even more. "They're looking for a nurse for the dying master," said Mrs. Jane. "He's in very bad health. It looks like terminal cancer. He needs someone with a medical degree. His previous carer left the other day." "It's understandable. You have to live here. You can't travel from the city," she continued. "What do you think? Not interested? I could recommend you. The salary, I'm sure, is very decent." Emily had her doubts. It's full-time. What about the kids? What about Mum? They can't manage without her, she thought. So Mrs. Mia would have to take care of all the worries and problems. No, it was absolutely impossible to make such a big decision without her. "Can I think about it?" replied the nurse politely. "I have children, Mum. You know, you have to weigh everything up and think it over." Of course, Mrs. Jane shrugged her shoulders. "Well, call." All the way back, Emily thought about the offer. A huge number of disadvantages: full-time work, a seriously ill person, constant presence in someone else's house. But there was a significant upside: the salary. And what to do? Back home, without putting things off, she called her mum in for a chat, told Mrs. Mia everything she knew. "What do you think?" Emily asked. "There are a lot of downsides, but I'm sure the labor will be well paid. You know, money's no object right now. But I don't want to make a decision without you. I mean, this is about you, too." "I think I can manage with the children," replied Mum. "There's no problem with that. After all, I understand that you can't live long with terminal cancer, right? It doesn't even last long. I'm more concerned about your morale. Being alone with a dying person all the time." "Don't worry, it's my job," she smiled as calmly as possible. She didn't want to upset her mother further. It was absolutely unnecessary. "Are you sure, Mum? You'll have a lot to worry about," Emily said. "I think we should at least try to talk about the terms in more detail, find out what and how, so you don't regret the opportunity. Fair enough?" "I'll do that," she nodded to her mum. It was early in the morning when the nurse called Mrs. Jane back. "Hello, Mrs. Smith," she said good-naturedly. "Good afternoon." "I'm sorry to disturb you," said Emily. "Can you tell me about the offer you made yesterday? Is it still valid?" The nurse came straight to the point. "I need to contact the landlady, Mrs. Chloe, and then I'll know." "I'll ring her. Ask her. If you still need a member of staff, she'll call you back. I'll give her your number." "That'll do," Emily said. "Yes, of course, thank you so much." "You're welcome," Mrs. Jane replied politely and disconnected. It was as if she were glad to be a part of someone else's fate. Indeed, not an hour later, Emily's phone came to life, calling an unknown number. It was the same Mrs. Chloe. A carer was still needed. They were on the lookout for a decent person and a professional. As the landlady immediately indicated, judging by the voice, it was a middle-aged woman, quite polite, Emily thought. There was a slight swagger and arrogance in her tone, but within acceptable limits. After all, by then she was used to worse treatment from those in power. The lady invited Emily for an interview, reasonably noting that they should look at each other in person, and then discuss the terms of employment in detail. By lunchtime, Emily arrived at the same luxurious house. A little worried inside, she reassured herself that she had not agreed to anything yet. As long as they only discussed the terms in detail, one could always politely decline. She's human too, after all, she has a right? That gave Emily's confidence a little boost. Surprisingly, the owner of the house, the wife of Emily's potential patient, Mrs. Chloe, seemed very friendly and calm. Periodically in this village, she was no longer surprised at the rudeness or neglect. But calmness and good-naturedness really struck her with novelty. Of course, there were exceptions. For example, the wonderful Mrs. Jane. But they were few, unfortunately. Mrs. Chloe gave Emily a detailed outline of her tasks and responsibilities. The pay was indeed magnificent. The nurse was overwhelmed by the generosity of the owners. Of course, the services were not free. The demands on the nurse were also very high. The most unpleasant news for Emily was that the owners required the nurse to live right here, in their house, to be with the patient. However, she was given one day off a week, Sunday. Of course, with the proviso that nothing extraordinary happened, and the patient was stable. So what was to be done? What was to be done? Emily was confused. With her mum, she had discussed at least a partial presence at home. Mrs. Mia was brave, but what would she be like with the kids 6 days a week, 24 hours a day? On the other hand, Mum wouldn't understand if Emily said no. Meanwhile, the landlady, noticing the confusion in Emily's eyes, wasn't about to give up. "I know it's a lot to ask," she said, "but my husband, Mr. Matthew, needs round-the-clock care. He's hard to get along with people and hard to get along with new acquaintances. But you must admit, we are prepared to pay a decent fee for your services," said Mrs. Chloe. "Of course, there is no question about that," Emily responded. "Just understand me. It's not an easy choice. I have a mum and 2 young children at home." Mrs. Chloe's face showed disappointment. Weighing the pros and cons carefully again, Emily decided to take the job. The pay was too good. It was a sin to refuse. If Mum was having a hard time, she could find a nanny too. With the income she had, she could afford it. Especially since jobs were scarce in their town. Local girls would gladly agree to look after children, not for fabulous sums. It was decided. Among other things, there were some other rules, which the hostess thoroughly voiced at once. Some of them confused the prospective carer a little. For example, Mrs. Chloe wanted to be aware of absolutely everything that happens to her husband. His state of health, of course, was part of her affairs. But the list didn't stop there. The spouse seemed to ask additionally to spy on the dying. Or was that just Emily's impression? The nurse had assumed that Mr. Matthew was the first to be satisfied with her services. In fact, it appeared that Mrs. Chloe was the center of all decision-making for her husband. This confused Emily, but she quickly worked out a logical explanation for herself. Perhaps Mrs. Chloe was showing her love and concern for the dying man by such suffocating control. It happens, doesn't it? People are different and deal with stress and grief in different ways. It would have been possible to have a long internal dialogue, to doubt, to search for arguments, to wonder. But what good was that going to do? Emily resolutely reminded herself that her job was to serve. What was she, in fact, a servant? What right does she have to meddle in the relationship of spouses, especially in such a difficult life situation? It is necessary to remember their place and the circle of duties. Fulfill them as agreed. After all, she was warned about everything at once. So what now? Now that that's settled, it's time to meet your ward. Mr. Matthew surprised Emily at first sight. For one thing, he was much older than she'd realized. She had probably inferred this from the age of his wife, thinking they were almost the same age. In fact, it turned out that the man was about 20 to 25 years older than his wife. If Mrs. Chloe gave the impression of a blooming and well-groomed middle-aged woman, Mr. Matthew, it was immediately obvious, was at a rather advanced age. And of course, illness does not make anyone look young or beautiful. That the patient was seriously ill was evident without a word. He was thin to the point of dryness, his face was grayish-yellow, and his eyes were tired and sore. However, Mrs. Chloe confirmed her husband's diagnosis, which her neighbor Mrs. Jane had given Emily. The man had terminal kidney cancer. There was nothing that could be done. There was no miracle. No, all the patient needed now was to relieve the pain and support his body as best he could. Emily was a familiar person, so surprise was not reflected on her face. On the contrary, she stepped towards the prospective patient with a good-natured smile. "Good afternoon, Mr. Matthew. I'm Emily, your nurse, if you'll excuse me." "Hello," the man said hoarsely. "Well, let's get acquainted. Chloe, you can go on. I can do it myself," he turned to his wife, who brought the nurse. The woman nodded and immediately retreated. It was clear at once that no one argues or bickers with the owner of the house. If anything is done against his will, it is done secretly behind his back. As soon as the wife went out and closed the door behind her, the man turned to Emily again. "Please sit down. Now I need to look at you closely to decide if you're right for me." Strange. The owner of the house spoke very politely, calmly, unusually respectful and intelligent. But still Emily's insides clenched. She didn't remember the rest of her conversation with Mr. Matthew very well. For the most part, it was like an interrogation. The patient asked questions, looking at her with challenge and interest. He seemed less interested in the answers themselves than in the nurse's reactions. Emily was terribly frightened and almost mesmerized by this tired stare across the room. Finally, Mr. Matthew clapped his hands on his leg. Yes, you're definitely the right man for me. I apologize for asking you. I may have overstepped the mark somewhere. But you see, I had to realize who I was going to spend the rest of my life with. It was a bold and even impertinent statement. What was I supposed to say to him? It was foolish to refuse and say that everything was still ahead of me. There was no reason to give up on herself. It would only offend the man, because everything is already clear. Why this pretense? So Emily could only squeeze out a neutral word. I understand perfectly. The next day, from the very early morning, Emily was picked up from the house by a driver. That was the arrangement, because the carer had to take her personal belongings with her. That's how her work at the home began. She drove to the neighboring town with mixed feelings. To be honest, she was already regretting and corrupting herself for taking the job. She was really intimidated by Mr. Matthew, his tenacious gaze as if he could look deep inside. Strangely, on the first day of work, the patient no longer looked so intimidating. On the contrary, the man was joking, trying to lighten the mood. There was no trace of that awful feeling of heaviness. Emily began to exhale a little, as she had to adapt to her new circumstances. It might seem silly, but the woman's anxiety wasn't going anywhere, not by a long shot. She was terribly uncomfortable in this house. Why? At first, Emily wrote it off to the lack of habit to live in such luxury, to adapt to new realities and new people around. But no, there were strange things about it. From the first days of her life in the mansion, the observant Emily began to notice something wrong. She seemed to be the mistress of the house, so intelligent, calm, polite, but everyone in the house walks on tiptoe in front of her and is clearly afraid of her. Why? Isn't it strange? It would be understandable if Mrs. Chloe were a tyrannical tyrant. But no, the nurse hasn't noticed anything like that about her. Not yet, anyway. Or was it just her? Was the landlady more demanding of the others? The house was as quiet as a crypt. For a mother of 2 children, accustomed to children's laughter, screams, and various sounds, this silence was terribly unusual. This, too, was blamed on the peculiarities of the character of the owners. Few people are sensitive to sounds. Why not? Then the nurse learnt that no one was allowed to appear at the landlady's house without Mrs. Chloe calling. There was a floor of the house, the last, 3rd floor, and no one was allowed to go up there without prior approval. Even the maid cleaned there in the presence of the mistress. Strange, isn't it? Usually it was the other way around. It surprised Emily so much that she couldn't stand it and asked Amanda, the head housekeeper who was in charge of all the staff, a direct question. Why is it like this? Isn't it strange? But the curiosity was immediately condemned. Amanda coldly glared at the woman who was prying. Emily, she said formally and firmly, in this house you don't ask questions, you just follow orders or you're out of here in a flash. She got what she deserved, of course. As they say, curiosity is not a vice, but it's a big pig. That's true. Except that the nurse couldn't rest. And these secrets, this arrogant answer of Amanda's only made her want to know what was going on. In her free time, Emily began to look around, to listen discreetly, and slowly from the others showed interest in the 3rd floor of the house. It was just awfully interesting to find out what it was all about. But you can't guard nothing so meticulously if there's no mystery to it, can you? And one had to amuse oneself. Mr. Matthew grew tired very quickly, and often dozed off. It was soon discovered that Mrs. Chloe had an additional entrance to her 3rd floor. So yes, it was accessed in the traditional way, simply by going up the main staircase. But there was an additional route. Emily had learnt about it quite by accident. At night she couldn't sleep, so she read by the window with her e-reader open, without turning on the light. She enjoyed occasionally looking up from her book and gazing at the beautiful moon. The view from the 1st floor of the house was magical because of the proximity of the water. The nurse was distracted from her book by the sound of the front gate opening. Needless to say, she began to watch carefully to see what was going on, who could be arriving at 3 a.m. The car was unfamiliar to her, but she couldn't see much. The car instantly rolled away into the garage. No one ever came out of the garage. Yes, there was an entrance to the house, but the woman would have heard it. The door from there was almost directly below her room. But there were sounds on the 3rd floor. Something was going on up there. Too bad it was impossible to make out anything. The soundproofing in the house was excellent, but there could be no doubt. Whoever this night visitor was, he bypassed the 1st and 1st floor of the house. and went straight up to Mrs. Chloe's apartment. The conclusion lay on the surface. In the huge house there were additional passages, entrances of which not everyone was aware. Now it became clear that the landlady was so sensitive about unexpected visitors to her floor. She did not need unnecessary witnesses. Even if it was still unsubstantiated, Emily was convinced in her heart that her mistress was visited by her lover at night in secret. Why not? She thought. She's still a fairly young woman. Nature takes its course. Though it was a bit of a shame about Mr. Matthew. What about him? It was only the woman's inner torment. There was no thought of intruding into the private affairs of the couple. She had satisfied her curiosity. Now everything fell into place. It was simple, even banal. The secret of the lady of the house was as old as the world. From that day on, Emily was completely at ease. Why was she afraid she'd stumble upon some scary skeletons in the wardrobe? What was really to be feared? And a lover, what a thing. Except that the nurse's previous interest did not go unnoticed by the house staff. Kate, the young housekeeper maid, even decided to give her colleague some unsolicited advice over a cup of tea. And the girl, lowering her voice, said, "It's none of my business, but I'd like to warn you. Be aware that in this house snitch on snitch. Don't lose your job because of your long nose." Emily pretended not to understand what she was talking about. "Why would I be in trouble?" "I don't get it, Kate. What are you talking about?" "Everyone here knows you've been asking Amanda all sorts of questions about her mistress's oddities," the maid retorted. The nurse wasn't about to give up and just shrugged. It just seemed odd. So I asked her if there was anything she needed to know. "Maybe Mrs. Chloe's got a crocodile living there. How would I know?" Emily said, deliberately slipping into absurdity to nip this conversation in the bud. She didn't like what Kate had said, and she didn't want to continue this conversation. She didn't want to involve herself in these internal matters. "Come on, have you seen Mrs. Chloe's lover yet?" Kate asked her forehead. Only Emily decided to use the advice that had just come to keep her mouth shut. "I mean, there are snitches." "I don't know what you're talking about right now," Kate the nurse said as seriously as she could. Why did she want to go to all this trouble? Kate was defiantly silent in response. Of course she didn't believe it, but she had no evidence to the contrary, which was a good thing. Emily hadn't even told her mum about seeing a mysterious overnight visitor who'd inexplicably ended up on the top floor of the house. She didn't need all that smutty gossip and idle talk. The nurse reasoned pragmatically her career in this house was fleeting. So it was a great folly to ask questions and show interest. She should have been smarter than that. To go about her business quietly, stay out of the way, get paid, and exist quietly and peacefully with everyone under the same roof. After Mr. Matthew's death, Emily would have to look for a new job, and the widow's recommendations would be useful. Cynical, I suppose, but it's the truth of life. To take her mind off what was going on in the house, Emily went to work. She was already very conscientious about her duties, and now she was concentrating on Mr. Matthew. She tried to do her best to make the patient feel as good as possible, both physically and mentally. It was her job to relieve the man's condition, which Emily did from morning to night. At first, they got to know each other. The businessman was wary of the nurse. His character and difficult life and professional path strongly affected his attitude to people and to life in general. After a while, when Mr. Matthew got used to the carer, he began to treat her more and more warmly. He told her things, showed her things, explained things. It must be said that Emily was also very interested. She admired the man's life, his experience and knowledge. The patient found in the nurse an outlet. He could see that Emily was completely sincere about him. Yes, she worked here, but it was not her job to feign curiosity or interest, to talk about herself, to share news. Mr. Matthew, in turn, was interested in the woman's life, children, her life in general. As it turned out, despite the huge money, the businessman was now very lonely. The disease had done a terrible thing to him, cut off the way to communicate with the world. His strength was not the same. His health was failing. He could no longer afford to go about his business, to solve problems, to act. And that was his life. He breathed it. And now he'd been cooped up before Emily came along. In fact, the businessman's entire social circle was his wife and domestic staff. Occasionally, doctors and other medical professionals would show up. Occasionally, when the situation was extraordinary, Mr. Matthew would also be contacted by the manager, on whom the business and affairs now rested, and that even these contacts were infrequent. All communications were strictly controlled and regulated by Mrs. Chloe. Of course, she was guided primarily by the care of her husband. He was not allowed to strain himself for trifles. The businessman resisted. It seemed to him that the disease is not a verdict. After all, medicine has made such a step forward. But the only thing is that both our and foreign specialists have divorced their hands too late. Unfortunately, the disease had gone too far. To Mr. Matthew's credit, it should be noted that even after hearing the verdict, he did not think of giving up. He believed and hoped that everything was still ahead of him, that a miracle would happen. The man did not think to slow down the old pace of life, to change his hardened habits. And that's when his body gave up. In addition to the underlying disease, the man had a heart attack. This finally crippled him. "Are you in a big hurry to get to the other side?" resented, without hiding his emotions, the attending physician. It was natural and fair Mr. Matthew finished his story to Emily. Health is not ironclad, as it turned out. Suddenly I was aging, like all mortals. I didn't want to believe it. The nurse nodded sympathetically. She understood the old man's emotions. How many times she had heard such stories from her patients. Yes, unfortunately, a man realizes that he is mortal and fragile too late. Now, Mrs. Chloe took this situation into consideration and began to use it as a final argument in any dispute with her husband. In this way, she managed to restrict his communication and put him in the house. The patient complained. "Now, Chloe always tells me that it's not enough what happened. Don't you get it the first time? What can you say? What can you say?" Emily understood one thing: Mr. Matthew was very unhappy with the situation, but could not do anything. He was very ill indeed, and it was not even within his manly power to change anything. His vulnerability was enormous. She felt sorry for this elderly, tired, dying man. But what could she do? Except sit and chat, try to cheer him up or make him laugh, play his favorite game of backgammon. Whatever was within her power and her modest capabilities, Emily was happy to do. It was such a pleasure to see the old man's face sometimes genuinely light up with warmth and joy. Thoughts of Mr. Matthew never left Emily. Even on the one day off she spent at home with the children and Mrs. Mia's mother. Something was keeping the woman on edge. She couldn't get her patient out of her mind, even though it seemed as if she longed to be with her beloved family. But even away from the mansion, her thoughts overcame her. Mrs. Mia couldn't help but notice the change in her daughter. "So tell me, what's wrong? What's going on in this house? You're not yourself." At first, Emily tried to avoid direct questions. She didn't feel comfortable gossiping, discussing other people's lives. But her mom wouldn't give up. "Daughter, but look at yourself. If it's so terrible, let's leave this job. God with the money will get by just fine." The unhappy woman really couldn't find any peace. Who but she knew and felt her daughter. Emily only gave in because her heart was very heavy. There were thoughts of Mr. Matthew and of the situation in the house, and her mother's anguish only added to her neurosis. Moreover, knowing her mother, the woman did not worry this information will not go anywhere beyond these walls and will not become public. And Emily shared all her experiences and observations under the eyes and heavy sighs of Mrs. Mia. "You see, my heart is troubled for him. Leaving him behind makes it hard. Even though I'm coming to see you, I know I'll finally get to see Anne and Matthew off the video link. Daughter, I know you have a heart of gold, but you can't do this. Why do you have to be so hard on yourself? The man is leaving. His journey on earth is almost over. Why kill yourself over him? Especially since it was only his choice that led to such a finale and sunset. I'm not happy, of course. But what can I do? His loneliness cuts me like a knife. And Mrs. Chloe has a lover behind her husband's back. I can't believe it. I wish I'd gone to the old man's house more often." Anyway, Mum strongly advised Emily not to interfere. What's the use of interfering? You realize you're the one who's going to be the one to blame. And who's really going to listen to you? Yes, I understand, Mum, but I feel sorry for him. It's the boredom and loneliness that's killing him more than the illness. And his wife is just manipulating him, pushing his buttons. That's all. But you can't help everyone. Take pity on yourself, on your nervous system. You can help him just by doing what you can. But you can't meddle in other people's affairs, it's too dangerous. The nurse nodded in agreement. Of course, these exhortations from her mother were perfectly logical and fair. No one would argue. But what to do with her feelings and emotions was the question. It had been like this for almost 3 months now. It could not be said that the time flew by quickly, rather strictly on the contrary. Every day in the mansion was a torment for Emily. Oh, how she would love to give up this job. Everything about the house exhausted and irritated her. The more she learned, the more she became involved in the local customs, the worse it became. She was literally short of breath. What money was there? Already everything was no fun. It's amazingly simple. You look at the extremely wealthy people from the outside and only snort disdainfully. What's your problem? Money can buy everything. Emily, too, was a victim of that stereotype. It always seems that way when you're struggling for a pittance. But now the nurse was plunged headfirst into that world, and she wasn't happy about it. God, I'd rather be on the dole than this horror. This money really does spoil people. Mrs. Chloe no longer seemed the same to Emily as when she first met her. Now, having lived with her under the same roof, the woman saw her true nature, her arrogance, saw the consumerist and manipulative attitude to the old man's husband. It was just an unbearable, inhuman sight. Sometimes I wanted to stand up and say, "What are you doing?" But, according to her mother's precept, she humbly kept silent, no matter how sorry she felt for the businessman. Only she was right. Isn't Mr. Matthew to blame for everything? Is it not his fault and his connivance in all that is happening? Didn't he marry young and beautiful? Why should Emily now lay her head on the scaffold to save him because of this? Mrs. Chloe's lover came more and more frequently. His presence in the house was still carefully concealed, but all the household seemed to have known about him for a long time, except the master of the house, of course. Lately, though, the nurse began to think that he, too, had guessed what was going on behind his back. He only kept silent because he couldn't do anything anyway. In general, this environment of endless lies, deceit, self-interest, and inhumanity drove Emily to despair. She sobbed, resisting with all her might. And she would have left, honestly, if it hadn't been for one thing: she didn't want to leave Mr. Matthew. She didn't. Not even it was his own fault. It was his own fault. It was his own fault that he wanted to marry a mannequin. Auto training didn't help. Nothing helped. Instead of rationality was the usual female heartfelt pity. After all, how long did he have left? Emily knew for sure. Not long. And wasn't it worth stepping on the throat of her own song just to brighten the dying man's last days, to keep him from being sad? To amuse him, to entertain him, to distract him from his sad thoughts. After all, there is no guarantee that the new carer will not just be formal about everything. After all, that's all the landlady asked for. Everything else was already Emily's personal initiative. No, I can't do that. I will be with him until the end, the woman resolutely summed up all her doubts and metamorphoses. After all, she had a conscience, and then she would have to live with the burden on her heart. What was there to be patient about? At least because of this. At least for the sake of herself and her selfishness. After making the final decision, it was somehow easier on her soul. After all, there was no longer that inner pendulum. Now the nurse saw a clear end in front of her: the death of her patient. And she would be with him to the end. A week or so passed, and everything was going relatively smoothly and calmly. Nothing heralded a new blow and a new calamity. This night the nurse, as usual, did not sleep. Damn this house. It really did give the woman sad thoughts and a depressing effect on her psyche. The nurse tiptoed into Mr. Matthew's room. In the dark she could see well at night, and she could navigate the house very well, too. She felt uneasy, so she decided to visit the old man one more time, as she was accustomed to do. Even if there was no call, she still checked on him. There was nothing to worry about. This time everything was quiet. The man was sleeping peacefully, breathing evenly, not a cause for concern. Emily mentally crossed herself. Thank God, all is well. The thing was, Mr. Matthew was looking worse and worse, and the end was clearly near, hence the woman's anxious state of mind was only growing. How long does he have left? A week? A month? No one knew how much longer the tired, powerless organism would struggle, but as the nurse exhaled heavily, relief from her heart, at least for a period of time. There was no sleep in either eye. The nurse decided to go down quietly to the ground floor, walk to the kitchen, and get a drink of water. The nerves made her mouth terribly dry. In order not to attract unnecessary attention of the staff, the nurse decided not to switch on the light. Why? She could see everything perfectly well as it was. She was already familiar with almost every corner of the house, except Mrs. Chloe's room on the third floor, of course. Emily had never been there. Still in her thoughts, the woman moved down the stairs, treading carefully, moving as quietly as possible. It would seem that there was no need to hide. She had done nothing of the sort. So much for going to the kitchen at night to get water. But just in case, Emily was used to blending in with the walls in the house. The safest way to live here was to keep a low profile. And just then, on a flight of stairs just between the first and first floors, the nurse heard that there was someone on the ground floor. The sounds of two voices were clearly coming to her. This was strange. The landlady didn't usually come downstairs, and the servants had long been asleep. Who could it be, and how long had it been going on? Emily realized that she might not have heard something, being inside herself, having her own internal dialogue. The people downstairs were arguing heatedly about something, though they were trying to keep it as quiet as possible. The nurse froze in panic, as if she had been caught by someone in the act of committing a crime. A completely incomprehensible and inexplicable feeling. Why all of a sudden? But inside, everything was screaming danger. The body was furiously waving a red flag. Why was this happening? Emily didn't even understand at first what the reason for such a nervous reaction was, and only then logic pulled up following the conclusion that had long since been drawn by the subconscious and the inner voice. Right? This house is all about secrets. Everyone lives in suspense. And what if the mistress found out that the servants had overheard something that should not have touched her ears? There was no doubt about it, the decision would be unequivocal. And the bystander would be thrown out in a flash. Her heart was pounding frantically. A second thought came to her: what if Emily's only fooling herself? What if it's just someone on the staff fighting? Why would she immediately think something bad? The woman, barely containing her anxiety and tremendous inner tension, froze in place and turned to listen. To be honest, she didn't care at all about the interesting conversation, which by its format resembled more of a clarification of relations. She was only interested in one thing: how not to get caught. She reasoned that whoever was there would be better off if the others remained blissfully ignorant of the fact that their conversation had a bystander. The nurse didn't want trouble with any of the residents of the house, not even the maid or the gardener. The nurse had wanted to go up to the first floor and hide in her room. Except that now it was risky. She might make an accidental noise or touch something, or trip. It's always the law of meanness when you're trying to be quieter than water. Don't make a move. It's better to wait. There wasn't much chance of being caught on the stairs. All the house staff lived on the ground floor except for her. Emily lived in the next room to the master, which was reasonable and justified. The problem could arise if the landlady herself was in the kitchen, but that was unlikely. To avoid misunderstandings and unpleasant encounters, Emily strained and listened to see where the people arguing were. It was decided if people were coming this way, then she would take her chances and start climbing up to her place. For now, she would wait. Maybe Emily's behavior wasn't the most logical. Afterwards, in hindsight, she had reasoned and thought many times about the best course of action. Only what good would it do now? A person who is in constant nervous tension, caught by surprise at night, does not always reason as logically, sensibly, and reasonably as a person in other, more typical and stable circumstances. She could blame herself all she wanted now, but what had been done couldn't be undone. Emily froze on a flight of stairs in complete darkness, listening to the voices that came to her, barely audibly concentrating on the sounds from outside. The nurse immediately recognized the woman's voice. The most frightening theory was confirmed. It was Mrs. Chloe. The male voice was unfamiliar to her, although by the emotional message and the manner of communication between the couple it was immediately clear that this man was the mysterious lover of the mistress. Damn it, she cursed to herself. Her thoughts were racing. What to do now? Run or freeze with terror and panic? The carer chose the second option. She turned into a plaster statue, unable to move. Her heart was pounding so hard she thought she could hear it a few meters away. Her head rumbled and her mouth felt even more dry. She was incredibly scared to stay here and scared to run away. Worse, now she heard bits of phrases, some details of the conversation, and a cold sweat broke through her insides. Mother dear. The poor, already terrified woman nearly had a panic attack. Emily no longer had any illusions about her landlady. In the months she'd been in the house, she'd already worked out what Mrs. Chloe really was. But there were limits. Everything has limits. "You don't realize how urgent this is," she whispered, trying not to raise her voice. "That old goat could die any minute." "So what then?" A male voice instantly parried. "Don't you realize that there's no hurry? He's sick, but not insane, in case you haven't forgotten. And if he guesses, suspects something wrong, what then? Not only will he not sign a bloody thing, but can you imagine our prospects if it all comes out? Like we didn't take risks before. We don't have time for small talk in front of this old bloke now. Do you understand? Mr. Matthew could be finished at any minute." The lover was clearly angry, and he didn't even hide it. The next phrase he said with a burst, even with some aggression, though with a share of some fatigue. "My God, Chloe, and what do you suggest? What do you want exactly?" And the hostess apparently only waited for this. She seemed eager to share her plan. "I'll try to slip him a deed of gift," she said. "Among other documents, of course, to increase our chances of success. We could switch his glasses, for example." As she finished her thought, Mrs. Chloe breathed heavily, so heavily that even Emily could hear it. She was clearly waiting for the man's reaction, what he would say, how he would react. But he was in no hurry to share his opinion. A tense silence hung. "It's a crude idea, but it's interesting," he finally said. "It could work. But will Mr. Matthews sign the papers if he can't see the text? He would never have made such a mistake before." "He would," Mr. Matthews' wife exclaimed confidently. "He just needs the old man to be in the right condition, tired, exhausted. Preferably right after a shot of morphine. I know what the anesthetic does to him. It's not hard now. He's in so much pain that he gets injections several times a day." The lover replied after a short pause with some thoughtfulness in his voice. "Well, yes, perhaps it could work then, but that's only a possibility. Don't forget that there is also a huge risk. He who doesn't take risks doesn't drink expensive champagne and dies poor," the woman retorted angrily. "I'm not ready not to at least try. Have you seen the current will? I'll be a pauper with a pittance to my name." "You're right about that. The benefits and the prospects are tempting." "That's what I'm talking about." "Sweetheart, shall we all go back to the bedroom?" The poor nurse continued to stand motionless. What was she going to do now? The panic inside was only growing. Here now the lovers would go to their main staircase and discover her. Just awful. Stupid. But from panic and from shock, Emily couldn't decide what to do. Just stood motionless, hesitant to do anything. Like that indecisive person, afraid to make any decision at all. After a few minutes, Emily realized that the people below had left. They couldn't have come up so slowly. No, that's right. They'd just gone downstairs. Apparently into the garage to climb back up to the third floor undetected by their separate staircase. It's impossible to describe the nurse's emotions at that moment. She almost died of fear. Unable to bear the strain, Emily sank straight down onto the marble staircase. Her legs wouldn't hold up any longer. Her body seemed to have exhausted its last resources. She had a terrible urge to cry, to feel sorry for herself, for Mr. Matthew, for the injustice of the world. A lump came to her throat. It was probably at least 20 minutes before the nurse forced herself up with a willful decision. She had to at least make it to the kitchen, to finally get a drink of water. She was literally dying of thirst. Climbing down the stairs on woozy, still naughty legs, Emily drank a liter of water in a gulp. She couldn't get drunk and she couldn't catch her breath. The woman was scared as it was, but this incident of eavesdropping on a conversation was crossing all possible boundaries. There was only one question: God, what am I going to do about this now? Emily was angry with herself. She had to be in this place at this minute. Ah, with what happiness she would have remained in ignorance. Who would have known why she needed someone else's problems? And what to do with this knowledge now? Only unnecessary torment and remorse. There's no real way out. It is necessary to admit, at least to herself, she was in a hopeless situation. There's nothing she can do. Who will believe her? It's word against word. Only Mrs. Chloe's word would be more authoritative, more meaningful. And then who would believe her? A simple carer. It seemed the most sensible course of action was to just stay out of it, to forget this night's incident like a nightmare. Nothing had happened. After all, it would be better that way, and rightly so. Since that damn night, Emily had been walking around the house like a shadow. She'd been careful before not to have contact with anyone except Mr. Matthew. Not to be seen by anyone. Not now. When she heard her mistress's voice, the nurse tried to get away immediately. She was afraid that Mrs. Chloe would know from the look on her face that she was aware of it. The woman knew well enough that she was not a very good actress. Perhaps the fear was in vain, but why test fate? She tried to forget about that unfortunate, accidentally overheard conversation between lovers. To be honest, Emily wasn't doing a very good job. Her thoughts kept revolving around one topic. She kept trying to figure out how to proceed. Should she listen to her conscience or be coldly calculating? She was desperate to consult her mother. Mrs. Mia always knew how to find the right approach, the right words. But how to tell her over the phone was impossible. It's only Thursday night. There's still a lot of time before the next day off. What if Mrs. Chloe plans to do her dirty deeds before then? Or worse, in the absence of a carer? Obviously, a decision had to be made. Only Emily was having a complete paralysis of will here. An unbearably difficult choice. She wanted very much to shift the responsibility for the decision to anyone else, but not to take this huge burden on her shoulders. Emily was very angry at herself, at the fate that had put her in this position. Certainly at her lover, yes, even at Mr. Matthew. On Friday morning, out of the blue, the landlady announced to Emily, "Mr. Matthew needs a routine checkup at the clinic. Then we have business to attend to. So you're free until 5 this evening." "Are you sure you won't need me? You won't need any help?" Mrs. Chloe only gave the nurse a negative nod of her head. "Well, that's lucky. So we could go home and talk to Mum." Emily didn't know what kind of reaction Mrs. Mia was expecting. To put it bluntly, she needed the advice to put the responsibility on someone else's shoulders. Emily expected to do exactly as her mother suggested. She was sick of thinking about it herself. How tired she was of the house, the dying patient, the constant worry. And this situation, she wanted to get away from it all, to rest, to take time out. Mrs. Mia, listening to her daughter's detailed account, gasped, "Emily, I don't even know what to advise you. It's like a vicious circle. You don't even know what's the best thing to do." "I don't know either," Emily said. "I wish I could just walk out of there and never come back. But how can I leave Mr. Matthew? It would be a betrayal." "Oh, I don't know. What if you interfere? Have you thought about what it might do to you?" "Let's be reasonable and objective," Mum urged. "There's a very good chance that you'll achieve nothing but suffer in vain." The nurse listened to Mum in silence. "She's right. Yes, she's absolutely right." Emily thought about it herself. "Imagine," Mrs. Mia went on, "you'll only bring a great power upon yourself, this Mrs. Chloe, also her lover. God knows who he is. You're playing blind. What's it going to come out to? Nothing good. And in that orbit, it'll be you, the kids, me. Everything could be at stake. I mean, we're talking about colossal amounts of money, aren't we?" "Mum, I know all this," Emily exclaimed. "Do you know how many times I've run every possible scenario through my head? Believe me, countless. And what's the main conclusion? I don't care about my conscience or my honor. Pardon the high-handedness. Mother." Mrs. Mia watched her only daughter's torment with bitterness. She understood her perfectly well. She understood her distress. She wanted so much to help her. The woman understood how to do it, to take the blow for herself, offering a ready-made solution. "Yes, leave it as it is," she nodded. Mr. Matthew knew perfectly well who he had married. He'd done it all on his own. No one forced him. It's not your business to save his capital now. It would cost you a lot of money. And for what? There's a good chance he'll die in blissful ignorance. You're the one who says he doesn't have long to live. Emily listened carefully to her mother and only sighed heavily. Of course, if you looked at the situation rationally, if you approached it with a cool head, of course Mum was right. Except where to put that damn conscience that was pushing her towards an emotional and stupid decision? Emily nodded and even gave Mrs. Mia her promise to stay out of other people's problems. She was having a hard time with that, a very hard time. The woman crossed her daughter in farewell and shouted, "Be good." Emily wanted to believe that she would do it, that she would keep her promise to her mother. It's over. It had to be accepted as a fait accompli. The decision had been made, and there was no turning back. But that was easy to say, but not to accept. The nurse's heart and soul were still not in the right place. It was good that things were going peacefully and quietly in the house. There was no new upheaval. I wonder if this was the calm before the storm. Whatever it was, Emily even calmed down a little. Talking to her mom had done her good, calmed her down. She sort of accepted the whole situation for what it was. On Sunday, she didn't get to go home. The old man was not well at all. She wouldn't have left him like that herself. And the landlady came round and reminded her. "Emily, you remember our condition. This is a force majeure. I can't let you go." "I understand." "Of course I'll stay with Mr. Matthew. Don't worry," Emily replied. There was a moment when the woman thought, "This is the end," but the patient's condition suddenly improved. Emily's joy was genuine. The man had become very dear to her. On Tuesday afternoon, Mrs. Chloe found the nurse in the kitchen as she ran in for a bite to eat. "Mr. Matthew needs an injection urgently," she said. "We've got things to do in half an hour," Mrs. Chloe said in a commanding tone. "There's no way we can put them off for a couple of hours. You may be excused, but be at home just in case." Emily, of course, understood at once. Today was the X-day the lovers had agreed on. Mr. Matthew's crisis had spurred them into action. It was clear that they could not delay any longer, that it was dangerous. So it was now or never. The nurse meekly did as Mrs. Chloe demanded and retired to her room. She wanted to be away from her master's study, where the meanness would be done, to abstract herself from the situation, from the outside world. Emily even began to read a book, but realization eluded her. It was simple, her thoughts were not here. No, she couldn't do this. How could she even live with herself after this? Emily clearly realized she wouldn't be able to resist her gut, her conscience that was screaming and begging for action. She was angry at herself, at her integrity, her honesty, her integrity, and her uncompromising character. Emily stood up resolutely and walked out of the room. She headed straight for Mr. Matthew's office, where the action was now unfolding. She stopped at the door. It would be a good idea to see what was going on in there. She didn't want to burst into the office without any information. She leaned over to the keyhole, listening. As expected, 3 people were present, all the same characters: Mr. Matthew, Mrs. Chloe, and her lover. The male voice the nurse recognized at once, and it brought her back to the memory of that terrible night, overwhelmed with emotion. There was no place for them now. Emily turned to listen. How quickly it became clear the mistress's lover had been at this meeting for a reason. He was, as it turned out, also Mr. Matthew's notary. What a simple mystery. Now the lover's plan was clear. Mrs. Chloe sang in a sweet voice to her ailing husband. "Darling, but you do realize that this is a very good deal. The benefits will be enormous. You can't pass up a chance like this. It's just stupid." The old man obviously listened, as he was in a kind of prostration, which is not surprising if you remember about the recent horse dose of anesthetic. But the businessman tried not to show it. "I've read the CFO and development director's reports. Yeah, you're probably right. It's a nice piece of business. I think we're very lucky." "It's all ready to go," Mrs. Chloe said. "Michael's prepared all the documents. They just need to be signed, just like we agreed." "Well, let's sign them." The businessman exhaled heavily. This business conversation was given to him with obvious difficulty in overcoming. Emily wasn't even sure that he understood exactly what was going on. Emily was jolted by the next question Mr. Matthew asked. "Look, what's wrong with my glasses? I can't see a damn thing. I can't focus my eyes. I can't focus my eyes," the old man complained. His wife, obviously, expected this complaint and answered as casually as possible. "Everything seems to be all right, not cloudy. Would you like me to bring you a napkin to wipe them?" Emily thought that the voice of the hostess still a little trembling. Or was it just that? Characteristically, the notary, aka the mistress's lover, was silent. Cunning, not such a fool as to set himself up and raise his voice. Of course, there's no telling how things might turn out. You shouldn't, Mr. Matthew replied good-naturedly to his wife's suggestion. His eyesight must have gone completely blank. I'm not surprised at anything anymore. It's a bloody old disease. All right, Michael, you've read and checked everything carefully. I'll sign it. I'm so tired I heard the rustle of paper as the old man flipped through the documents. This was the decision point here, and now it was make up your mind or run away, throwing away all doubts. Emily flew into the patient's office in a whirlwind. She did not think to stop, hurrying to the table where the sick businessman was sitting. From surprise, the hostess at first even shrieked. Of course, her heart had probably frozen in anticipation of a huge score. And now this surprise. What's going on here? What do you think you're doing? Mrs. Chloe shouted in an angry voice. But Emily wasn't going to stop. It was not for this that she had dared so long to be timid at this shout. No, she paid no attention to her hostess or to the speechless men. Emily rushed to the table without a word. She snatched the pile of documents from Mr. Matthew's hands and with a swift movement tore them in half. Among other things, there was a deed of gift. The woman didn't doubt that for a second. It was already a silent scene. The notary, Mrs. Chloe's lover, only flapped his eyes in amazement. Apparently, he had not yet decided how to react. The already lethargic Mr. Matthew also just stared at the nurse. A mute question lingered in his eyes, what's wrong, but he remained silent, continuing to stare at her in bewilderment. Emily, meanwhile, was trying to catch her breath. Only Mrs. Chloe wouldn't stop. She was literally like a hysterical woman, shouting at the servants in a bad voice. "Girl, what do you think you're doing? What have you done, you idiot?" Mrs. Chloe obviously had many other insulting epithets. Emily did not even doubt that if you gave her a little time to analyze what had happened, a terrible hurricane would fall on her. "What is this? What do you mean?" Mr. Matthew came to life, expecting some kind of explanation. He had studied Emily well enough to know that a rational, logical explanation would follow. But what was it? "Who are you?" Wait, Michael bent his eyebrows. "Do you realize you're derailing a major deal? You're not going to get away with this." She didn't care about anyone else in the room. She was only addressing Mr. Matthew. Still clutching the two halves of the torn documents tightly, choking on her words, she tried to summarize the situation, to quickly recount the conversation she had overheard between the two lovers. She had to hurry. Now she would be interrupted, and that would be the end of it. Except that, to Emily's surprise, and the notary's, the patient's legal spouse froze with shock and surprise. It was too sudden a denouement. They probably didn't realize in their worst nightmare that someone had found out about their plans. "I understood that your will didn't leave anything to Mrs. Chloe," Emily finished as convincingly as she could. "So she slipped you a deed of gift to grab the business and property in advance." Mrs. Chloe couldn't bear it. She walked straight at Emily, glaring at her with rage boiling inside her, shouting, "Give me the papers at once. What nonsense is this, you idiot?" Except Emily had no intention of giving up. She'd been given a head start by letting her talk. Now she had to convince the patient. The old man's eyes couldn't tell who he believed. He didn't say anything out loud either. The carer went all in. "Mrs. Chloe, I won't give you back for anything. Mr. Matthew, hold this. Don't give it to them. Just a minute, please. I'll find your normal glasses with your diopters, and you'll see for yourself." It was a real battle between two women. They knew what was at stake, and they both knew they couldn't afford to lose. On hearing Emily's proposal, Mrs. Chloe tried to lunge at her, but she had already handed the papers into her master's hands. Mr. Matthew himself was stunned. The reaction of his wife, of course, he did not like, and he firmly told his wife in a threatening tone, "You can't come near me either. Don't you try it." Turning his gaze to the nurse, he turned to her. "Well, look for your glasses. If you don't think these are right for me, I'll read everything carefully, study everything, and we'll find out by experience which of you will go away with a wolf ticket." The lovers looked at each other in horror. Mrs. Chloe's mind was clearly changing from one thought to another. She was frantically trying to work out what she should do now. She must try to get out of it. There was no help from her beau. He was as white as a sheet and shaking like a leaf. Her wife decided to appeal to her emotions. "Matthew, do you really believe that wicked girl? What nonsense is this?" Mrs. Chloe even tried to laugh, but instead of ease in her voice showed a note of hysteria. "I told you we'll find out who we can trust," her husband said in a steely voice. His tone was clearly intolerant of objection. In a few minutes, Mr. Matthew was still sitting at his desk, studying the papers. With the glasses Emily had brought him, he could see every line and every letter. That in itself was proof that she was right. When he reached about the middle of the folder, the old man stopped suddenly. Mr. Matthew had obviously found what he was looking for. He looked round at the horrified and panicked audience and threw a careless glance at Emily. "Girl, call the police." Inside, Emily was jubilant she had risked it, not for nothing. Thank God Mrs. Chloe and Andrew had finally collapsed. They realized their fate was sealed. The businessman's wife didn't want to give up so easily. She tried to say something and beg her husband, but the policeman wouldn't listen to any excuses. Mr. Matthew was literally seething with rage. Apparently the adrenaline had given him strength, and the medication had weakened him a little. The old man was steadfast and firm. All attempts of the wife to soften his fate ran into a stone wall. Even Mrs. Chloe's unsuccessful lover raised his voice. "She forced me to do it. You understand, Mr. Matthew? Mrs. Chloe forced me to commit a crime. This mean and nasty thing I didn't want to do. God knows I was against it. Only this feeble effort to get away with it was taken worse. He was now an outcast in this room, not just to two, but to three." The master looked at Michael with ill-concealed hatred. He had clearly slipped into insignificance in his eyes. All further events developed rapidly. Indeed, the police arrived. Then came even an investigator from the investigative committee, a big boss. Everyone was extremely interested in what had happened, questioned, interrogated. Emily recounted the whole story 10 times, from beginning to end, answering endless questions. The end was obvious, and in fact joyless. The mistress of the house, already a former mistress of the house, was led out of the mansion with her lover in handcuffs. Well, Emily thought to herself, she'd said she wanted to take a chance. It hadn't worked out. Emily didn't have any schadenfreude. She was just dead tired, drained like a lemon. It's amazing. Such noise and noise, such a fight had been here just a few days ago, and now everything was quiet. I couldn't believe it. The house had returned to its former rhythm of existence, although, admittedly, the servants and all the staff breathed a sigh of relief. Gone was the oppressive atmosphere of the house, along with its former mistress. After that day, the patient never spoke to Emily again about what had happened. He was understandably distressed inside. It was a betrayal, as it seemed to him, of a kindred and close person. Mr. Matthew trusted his wife wholeheartedly and was struggling to recover from what had happened. Emily remained silent. Why was her case small? The essence of her work had not changed. She didn't expect any gratitude. For her, the best reward was her conscience and the feeling that she had done the right thing, no matter what. Except that the rest of the house staff were gossiping, savoring the details of what had happened. It was understandable they were all getting a kick out of the landlady. After all, Mrs. Chloe was a secret tyrant. And here at last was the long-awaited act of retribution and justice. Nevertheless, Emily did not interfere in these conversations and avoided direct questions. She was not comfortable with the subject. She wanted to forget the past as soon as possible. More than a week passed before Mr. Matthews suddenly turned to her. "Emily, I keep wanting to ask you, why didn't you tell me all this before? Why did you wait?" She didn't want to deceive the old man. It was sinful. She confessed to him, "Honestly, I was afraid for myself, for the children, for my mom. I didn't know how it would turn out for me, so I kept quiet. I didn't think it was my business to meddle in other people's affairs." Mr. Matthews smiled slyly at her words. "But still, I couldn't get past someone else's misfortune." Emily only shrugged her shoulders. What could she say? She couldn't praise herself, because there were still horrible scenarios in front of her eyes, where everything had gone horribly wrong, where Emily was guilty of all sins. She was just lucky. And what would have happened if luck had been on the side of Mrs. Chloe and her lover? It's frightening to imagine. With the old man, they left the subject again. Both he and she were uncomfortable remembering the past in detail again. Nothing had changed in their relations. They continued their cooperation on the same terms. Emily was also just a carer for a sick and dying old man. That suited everyone. They believed in the best. Except, unfortunately, the miracle didn't happen. Mr. Matthew passed away 2.5 months after all these events. As a medical professional, Emily understood perfectly well he was still lucky. His body was still fighting and resisting the cursed disease for a long time. But as a human being, as a woman, Emily wept sincerely for Mr. Matthew at the funeral. She had managed to become attached to the old man, even to love him. It was a sincere sentiment. Despite the expectation of an imminent end, the businessman's death still knocked the nurse out. She experienced his departure as the death of a beloved relative. A fortnight after the old man's funeral, she received a phone call. It was Mr. Matthew's trusted employee, and he stunned her by telling her that the patient had left Emily half of his fortune. From confusion and surprise, she at first took the news as a silly joke. What nonsense. It can't be, but the documents confirmed the man's words. It was exactly like that. At last the old man decided to ennoble Emily, who did not remain indifferent, who risked herself. It was a real shock. Emily was sad and happy at the same time. It was wonderful that she could now afford to take care of her children, to provide them with a decent future and education. But what a pity for the old man. Emily prayed for Mr. Matthew every night. Her sincere gratitude knew no bounds. Amazing and incredible. You never know where you will find and where you will lose. Life is an amazing thing, no matter how you spin it. The mother-in-law kicked the village orphan daughter-in-law out the door, and after a while of seeing her, numbers were crucial in Nayli's life. And could it be otherwise with more than 40 years of accounting experience? Immediately after the institute, she was assigned to a food processing plant, where she worked faithfully for more than 10 years, until the collapse of the union. The combine was drowning in debts, and by the mid-90s finally collapsed. While others ran in panic about tomorrow, Nayli, then still Nayli, quickly realized who takes control of the market, and through old connections got a job in a construction company, which was run by brothers. Nayli faithfully kept the books, often received good gifts from the bosses for labor in the form of cognac and expensive foreign candy. Nayli was not ashamed to participate in the dubious affairs of the owners of the company, then secured a spacious 2-room apartment in the center of the city for nothing. Own figures never let her down. She could rely on them and only on them. The dashing 90s were replaced by the new millennium. Gradually, loopholes and holes in the laws and taxation system became less and less. It was no longer possible to pull off the old schemes, and the legitimacy of her employer's business was becoming more and more suspicious. Nayli prudently quit her job when she realized that she smelled a stink, and went to work in the university accounting department. The pay there, of course, was more modest, but it was peaceful. Yes, and take a remote maintenance of document management of some small entrepreneurs. No one forbade her. Secretly, of course. The main thing was that the numbers were happy again. Soon Nayli turned into Nayli Smith. She was respected by her colleagues for her acumen, experience, and impeccable professionalism. She was also feared by the students, where Nina Ivanovna taught economics and other specialized disciplines, having quickly received a correspondence pedagogical education. Figures pleased, led her through life, and never once failed. Only in one thing the figures did not help. Nina Ivanovna had no personal life by the age of 60. True, there was a joyous son, Matthew. The woman met his father while she was working for the brothers. It was a visitor from the village, a handsome guy, with a rich imagination, who misled her. A pretty accountant. When Nayli suspected that he was interested in her apartment, specifically the propiska in it, she noisily kicked the suitor out and found out she was pregnant the same week. From a small age, Matthew she brought up disciplined, collected, and responsible. The boy at the age of 4 could fry eggs, never cried or complained. He graduated from school with a silver medal. Nayli dreamed that her son received a higher education, and therefore saved money for it almost from his first grade. And when he passed on the budget, and even at the law school, the woman could not rejoice. Money in one piece, and her son will be a lawyer, as she wanted. Since Matthew's birth, Nayli has never had another serious relationship. She'd had affairs, of course, but it was always numbers that interfered. The beau didn't earn enough. What kind of a man was he who earned less than she did? It's a shame to go out in public with such a man. He wasn't tall enough, or too old, or too young. And constantly it seemed to Nayli that all the gentlemen are trying to steal her living space, gained even if not quite honest, but painstaking labor. In the big city, there are many who want to settle down without much worry at someone else's expense. Nayli was determined not to be that expense. All she cared about were the numbers, the welfare of herself and her son. That evening, Nayli waited for her son to come to dinner, somehow nervously. First she broke a cup, then she scattered salt on the table. The woman was not a superstitious woman, but the resulting mess irritated her. Matthew had shown up at 9 o'clock, cheerful and overjoyed, a vivid expression of emotion he didn't often display. And Nayli didn't welcome such extravaganzas from experience. She knew they usually had 3 reasons, and they were rarely good ones: in love, drunk, or an idea that required money. The first had been settled long ago. Matthew was indifferent to that. He wasn't partial to the second one either, so. "Well, tell me what you've already thought up," Nayli asked, looking at her offspring from head to toe through her thin glasses. "What have you thought of, Mom?" Matthew tried to hide his enthusiasm, but it didn't work very well. He was literally bursting with bright colors. "I can't see it," the woman shook her head. Matthew hesitated and sat down on a stool at the table. He knew that, as usual, his mother rejected all his ideas. She thought she knew what was best for her son. No, Matthew was grateful for her sensitivity, but he had never tried to follow her instructions completely. When she forbade him to get a dog as a child, the enterprising Matthew disappeared to the house of his friend Andrew. He did not like his German shepherd Palma, and with the dog Matthew quickly got used to it, even walked with it, gladly replacing the lazy companion. After such walks of her son, Nayli wrinkled her nose, not understanding why suddenly the apartment smelled of dog. In high school, Matthew dreamed of playing the guitar, but Nayli said that the guitar was the domain of idlers. Look at Vysotsky. How much did he accomplish? Mother was wringing her hands in front of her son. But Vysotsky is a legendary man, 16-year-old Matthew parried. A good legend, a circus performer. Nayli spent her life in theaters with her guitar and eventually died at 42. You know why? You should lead a normal life, a serious life. Think about your future promising profession and not play the guitar. Matthew realized that it was useless to argue. His mother's stubbornness was strong. It was a blessing that she worked a lot and was interested only in her son's grades, regimen, and nutrition. Otherwise, Matthew was exempted from the need to report. If they didn't ask, they could. He got an old guitar, found new strings in the morning before dawn, and asked the music teacher to help him with tuning the instrument. In a couple of days, Matthew had a good guitar, though shabby, but it sounded perfect. He played it on camping trips with his class, at first-grade matinees at school, and in Andrew's father's garage. Open fingers he honed in cold water at night. After a few years, however, the love of strings in the guy waned, and the guitar stayed at Andrew's buddy in the garage finally. "Mom, you've been saving money for my education, and I'm studying on a budget." Matthew started from afar. Let's say Nayli raised her right eyebrow. She wasn't wrong again. "I was thinking that I could get a part-time job in the evenings after school. It's about time. I'm 22 soon." Matthew knew just how to placate his mother before revealing his part-time plans. "Who's stopping you?" Nayli agreed, not yet understanding the connection in her son's words. "Well, I got my license in high school, but I haven't had much practice. I have a license, I have free money, I need a car. I'll go to a cab, earn money, and gain experience. You'll always need a car." Matthew exhaled. "A car." Then Nayli muttered. Matthew waited breathlessly, like a pigeon, waiting for a handful of grain from its master. Nayli was figuring out what the car gave and what it would require. A vehicle of one's own was a convenience. Meanwhile, age was making itself felt with sore knees, blood pressure, and an increasing need to get around. The money spent on the car will not hit the family budget because it was put aside long ago. But the question of earning money, but let her son earn a penny, but really learn to drive, will become more responsible, as she wanted. The main thing is not to neglect his studies. The figures add up. A car is a necessary thing, Unlike a guitar, Nayli said more warmly. Matthew opened his mouth. He was already making backup plans, how to persuade his friend to hide the car at his place, how to deal with the evening absence. And now this was a gift. "Do you mind?" he asked with a smile he couldn't quite contain. "I'm not euphoric, but I support it," Nayli replied graciously. "Just be careful what you buy. Don't get a thank you." He hugged his mother, and happy, jumped into the room. Of course, the boy had lied a little. Yes, he did want a part-time job in a taxi cab. But even more than that, Matthew wanted freedom from his mother's control. A car offered that opportunity, even if only partially. He could have bought it on the sly. But that wasn't the way the budding lawyer's mind worked. Matthew realized that he needed to prepare the ground and get his mother's official permission to buy it. Then it would be difficult for her to accuse him of anything. And if you periodically bring in the money you earn, Matthew thinks, you'll get approval and you can relax. A week later, Matthew got a foreign car, though not a new one, but not a bad one. Dan, Andrew's father, personally helped him choose it. And a car mechanic can't go wrong. Andrew persuaded Matthew to celebrate the purchase on the first night, but he refused. Instead, he drove around the neighborhood, at first cautiously, getting used to the character of his new friend, and then boldly drove into the city. The car behaved perfectly. In the morning, Matthew drove his mother to work and then ran to his classes, and in the evening he drove around the streets, picking up passengers. Nayli was at first distrustful of the car, but quickly realized how much relief this means of transportation would bring her. Soon the woman got used to it, and even periodically asked her son if he had refueled the car after work and if it needed washing. Matthew chuckled in secret, but did not show it. He had another reason for buying the car, but no one knew about it. At 15, like any teenager, Matthew's hormones were running wild. He became interested in girls. No, the affable and agile boy had never had any trouble making friends with them. Now he was attracted to his former girlfriends in a different way. He wanted to talk to them, to do nice things for them, not just run around the yard. That's how Matthew got his first girlfriend from the parallel class. But when Nayli found out about it, she made a huge scandal. A cat in a bag. Ask a knowledgeable person for help. And don't try to skip classes and fail your diploma. "Mom, I know," Matthew reassured her. "Thank you." He hugged his mother and jumped into the room happy. Of course, the boy had lied a little. Yes, he really did want a part-time job in the cab business. But even more than that, Matthew wanted freedom from his mother's control. A car offered that opportunity, even if only partially. He could have bought it on the sly, but that wasn't the way the budding lawyer's mind worked. Matthew realized that he needed to prepare the ground and get his mother's official permission to buy it. Then it would be difficult for her to accuse him of anything. And if you periodically bring in the money you earn, Matthew thinks you'll get approval and you can relax. A week later, Matthew got a foreign car, though not a new one, but not a bad one. Dan, Andrew's father, personally helped him choose it. And a car mechanic can't go wrong. Andrew persuaded Matthew to celebrate the purchase on the first night, but he refused. Instead, he drove around the neighborhood, at first cautiously, getting used to the character of his new friend, and then boldly drove into the city. The car behaved perfectly. In the morning, Matthew drove his mother to work and then ran to his classes, and in the evening he drove around the streets, picking up passengers. Nayli was at first distrustful of the car, but quickly realized how much relief this means of transportation would bring her. Soon the woman got used to it, and even periodically asked her son if he had refueled the car after work and if it needed washing. Matthew chuckled in secret, but did not show it. He had another reason for buying the car, but no one knew about it. At 15, like any teenager, Matthew's hormones were running wild. He became interested in girls. No, the affable and agile boy had never had any trouble making friends with them. Now he was attracted to his former girlfriends in a different way. He wanted to talk to them, to do nice things for them, not just run around the yard. That's how Matthew got his first girlfriend from the parallel class. But when Nayli found out about it, she made a huge scandal. Matthew stood in front of his mother, almost crying, and she lectured him that studying was more important than relationships with girls. The boy wanted to spite his mother by continuing to date the girl of his choice. But Nayli did her best. She found the phone number of the girl's parents and strictly informed them that their daughter was distracting Matthew from his studies. The unyielding tone of the chief accountant put all the dots on I. Matthew had been shunned by a former friend at school. Nayli thought she was doing the right thing, because her own life had never been about the joys of love, only problems and nerves. Why waste precious time on such nonsense? First you have to achieve something, make a reputation, learn, and then look for a suitable couple. And only one that would suit her, Nayli, completely. And some empty-headed girl to stop her Matthew from moving forward. No. Matthew quietly hated his mother's position, but there wasn't much he could do about it. He realized it was useless to argue with her. He had to maintain a secret private life. However, whether it was his aura or Nayli's invisible hand of protection that stretched far away, every new girl did not stay with him for long. At the institute, a quiet horror began around Matthew. Everyone knew where his mother worked, and among graduate students and faculty, gossip spread at the speed of light. And every new girlfriend of her son, the overbearing accountant and part-time faculty member, crucified her classes as best she could. And if she couldn't do it herself, she asked her colleagues to do it for a small favor. One student, Nayli, and her comrades were so driven to such an extent that the poor girl transferred to another university. Matthew eventually realized that if you look for a friend, then outside the institute, where you can hide her from her mother as much as possible. Nothing good came out of this idea. His mother could detect the girl's presence near him by the smell of perfume. She called him if he was late after class. Matthew couldn't get out much, as Nayli encouraged only academic zeal or rare friendships. The shadow of his mother, always invisibly standing behind the young lawyer's back, frightened the girls, and they quickly severed relations with him. Of course, no one wanted to have such a principled and intrusive mother-in-law. Tiana stood in front of the restaurant manager, her tear-red eyes drooping to the floor. For the third time this week, Gavin was sternly reprimanding the waitress just around the corner from the kitchen. "Third time this week you've gotten on my nerves and made me look like an idiot in front of my guests," he said. "But I didn't mean to. I was pushed," the girl tried to justify herself. "We all don't want something. Tiana, you didn't want to break glasses on Monday? You didn't want to forget the dirty rag on the hall table on Wednesday? Didn't want to spill wine on our regular guest today?" The manager folded his arms and lowered his voice, instilling a faint hope in Tiana's heart. "I'll be more careful, honestly, I promise." Gavin sighed irritably. "Promise your mom you'll be back by 11 p.m., and I'll have to fire you. Employees like you are a loss and a disgrace to the establishment. You'll take the money you earned today as a paycheck for your shift and get out of here." Tiana opened her mouth, but the words stuck in her throat. Her eyes stung even more. The manager left. The girl worked a few more hours, despite the dislike of the restaurant's customers. She changed her clothes, stuffed a few bills into the pocket of her cloak, and slipped out of the service exit in a shadow. Only on the street did Tiana allow herself to cry. She had been used to the fact that nothing in life was easy since she was a little girl. Tiana had lost her parents early and knew how hard it was to earn a penny for bread. When she was 7, her family and little brother died in a fire. Nothing was left of the household. The frightened little girl was taken in by an elderly neighbor, Aunt Lexi. She raised the girl, gave her everything she could. But Aunt Lexi could not do much to feed, to drink, to love, and only that. The neighbor's modest money was not enough for beautiful clothes, toys, or sweets. People in the village do not live poorly at all. Tiana helped her mother as much as she could. She took care of the garden and a small farm with a dozen chickens while she was at school. From a small age, Tiana knew how to do everything around the house, cooking and baking. After school, she stayed with Aunt Lexi, even though she insisted on sending her to get an education. "How could I leave you?" Aunt Tiana was carefully smoothing the corner of the pillowcase with an old iron. "Come on, Tiana." Aunt Lexi sat in the chair next to her. "I'm not going anywhere. And you need to get on with your life. You're not going to be cleaning up after me forever." We had this conversation many times. Auntie was cheerful, but Tiana could see that she was finding it harder and harder to do her usual housework every month. In the end, the girl insisted that her aunt go to the city and be examined. The doctors prescribed heart medication and monthly routine checkups. Seeing the prices at the pharmacy, Tiana just splashed her hands. And then she realized that she had to leave after all to move to the city and work so that her aunt could be treated. Without education, it was hard for a girl to find a job, and she had to live somewhere else. On weekends, she took the train to the village to visit her Aunt Lexi. Tiana rented a tiny dorm room on the edge of town and got a job as a cleaner in a shopping center. Things went well at first, but one day she tripped and a bucket of water spilled out. As a result, one of the stores was left without lights and customers for 2 days. Tiana was fired without pay. The girl did not grieve long and decided to try to work as a nanny in a recruitment agency. They looked squeamishly at her manicure-less hands, dirty from working in the vegetable garden and scrubbing floors, and said, "We've looked at your nails and we're asking you to leave." Tiana sighed, but these very dirty by the standards of city ladies' hands did not put down. She started handing out leaflets and newspapers. True, the income from such work was quite modest. Once in those very newspapers, she saw an ad that the restaurant requires an assistant waiter, dishwasher. She was accepted without much questioning, was given gloves, a sponge, and told to start work the same day. For 2 months, the girl worked hard, washed and rubbed glasses, washed plates and pans to a shine. One day in the restaurant, a waitress did not come out. The manager burst into the kitchen, took a quick look at Tiana, told her to change, put on an apron, and go out into the hall to serve the guests. The first few days were hard, but the girl took to the task diligently. She quickly mastered the simple craft of waitressing. "You're fast," Gavin once told her. "It would be easier for me to hire a granny at the car wash than to look for an adequate employee in the hall." Things were going well at first, with customers leaving good tips. Tiana bought herself some decent clothes, sent more money to the village, some guests, and a supply of medicine for her aunt. And then the black streak began. Then that rag absent-mindedly forgotten in a hurry on one of the tables, then broken dishes. And now a guest poured wine on the table, and finally Tiana was fired. The girl walked down the night street, wiping her tears. The most frustrating thing was that she had already thought that everything was getting better, spent all the money and did not pay for the room on time. And the owners were waiting for payment and were already looking askew at the young tenant. When Tiana got home, she found another surprise. Her belongings had been piled carelessly into a gym bag and put out into the hallway with an obvious hint. There was no more strength to cry. The paycheck for one shift wouldn't be enough to pay for a month in advance. Tiana didn't grovel after being evicted in absentia. The girl grabbed her bag by the handles, unhooked her keys from the keychain, placed them on the bollard next to her, and left. The penetrating October wind blew in her face. She would walk to the train station, and there she would take the first train in the morning to her aunt's village. Cry quietly into her pillow at night, and try again. Each time, though, it was harder and harder, but the health of her family man was more precious to Tiana. Matthew was in a great mood. He had done a good job today. Outside the window, the streetlights, the bright signs, the neon lights of the city in the rain seemed to flow with color. It was even brighter. At night, from the beginning of the shift, the work went as smoothly as possible. There were expensive orders and interesting passengers. Until 6, Matthew discussed with a philosophy professor, laughed with animators in costumes, drove 2 elderly girlfriends to the theater. The guy liked to drive around the city. He felt free and relaxed. Of course, there were some silent passengers, but for some reason they were a minority. The atmosphere in the car apparently disposed even the hardened silent ones to talk. By midnight, the downpour had intensified. Matthew dropped off the last passenger at the edge of town, near the private sector, and decided that it was time to call it a day. He made a leisurely stop at a gas station, picked up a coffee and a sandwich, tipped the gas station attendant, and headed home in a melancholy mood. There were hardly any people on the streets at this late hour, so Matthew was surprised to see a girl walking along the curb. She was soaked through. She was carrying a heavy sports bag in her hands, and her cloak was useless. "Young lady, what are you doing?" "Get in. I'll give you a ride home." The guy stopped and opened the door from the passenger side. "And I have nowhere to go." He heard a completely broken voice. "I don't have a home here, but let me take you somewhere." "The weather's terrible," Matthew insisted. "It's free." He suddenly felt surprisingly sorry for the girl. Not because she was walking alone at night in a downpour, but because Matthew felt a silent call for help. The kind of call you might read in the eyes of a puppy abandoned in a box. "Sit down, please." I can't leave you here at a time like this. Matthew emphasized the word please very strongly. The stranger, he thought, sighed. Then she skipped over a puddle by the curb and grabbed the door handle. They drove in silence for a while. Matthew turned on the heater to warm the shivering passenger. How did you end up here? The boy was the first to ask, and Tiana told him. It was as if she had been saving it all up for months, and now she was out of control. She talked, and Matthew listened until he realized she was crying. You'll forgive me for sitting here crying like this. It's a terrible shame for you, a stranger, she apologized confusedly as the car stopped at a stoplight. Instead of answering, Matthew pulled some tissues out of the glove compartment. But why a stranger? My name is Matthew. He held out a paper handkerchief to the girl with a smile. Tanya, she sobbed in response. Well, now we know each other. Would you like some coffee or tea? Tanya had no time to answer, as he stopped at another gas station and disappeared in the doorway. 5 minutes later, he handed the girl a hot cup, a small chocolate bar, and threw his jacket from the back seat over her shoulders. They pulled off to the pad to the side. Matthew tried to lighten the mood as best he could, even trying some awkward jokes. This girl's story seemed to him like a mockery of fate, and at the same time he felt a desire to help. It was strange. Matthew wouldn't call himself sentimental or tearful. He didn't give money to beggars, and he wasn't Benjamin. And now I have nowhere to go. I can hardly afford a hotel. I don't know much about the city. Tanya finished her story, warming her fingers on a hot drink. Please bring me to the station. If you don't mind, I'll wait for the train there. You'll freeze at the station in your wet clothes. Stay at my place, and tomorrow I'll take you to the station, Matthew said. The words came out of his mouth before he could think about it. He didn't think about his mother or morality at that moment. He wanted from the bottom of his heart to do something good for his accidental passenger. Tanya froze and for the first time truly stared at Matthew in amazement. He nodded silently, with a slight smile, confirming his offer. And Tanya suddenly agreed. Tired, wet, exhausted, she figured she simply had nothing to lose, and so be it. That late evening, Matthew spoke to his mother in a way he had never spoken to her before. Nayli, of course, was against the idea of her apartment acting as a lodging house for unemployed women. However, for the first time, her son did not ingratiate himself to her or ask for permission, but spoke in a voice as firm as a rock. Nayli felt a chill run down her spine. So different from the Matthew she was used to. She'll clean herself up, and I'll see her off tomorrow morning, he said. Don't embarrass yourself, Mom. If you can't kick the poor girl out, you'll only embarrass yourself in front of her and the neighbors. Matthew firmly contradicted his mother once more and went downstairs to the car to fetch Tiana. Nayli was quietly seething, but for some reason she couldn't object. Had something about him changed that evening? Something that made the woman, against her will, look at her son differently. The university's chief accountant defiantly closed herself in her bedroom and turned off the lights. Matthew put Tiana in his room and moved to the sofa in the living room. The girl's wet clothes were hung on the backs of chairs and radiators. Good night to you, Tiana, he said as he closed the door. Good night to you too. Thank you, the girl replied, lay back on her pillow, closed her eyes, and for the first time in many days truly smiled. Matthew stood outside the door, wondering what had happened to him today. Was it an attack of pity, compassion, an outburst of emotion, or had his soul reached out to someone unfamiliar but dear, someone in need of protection and care? Early in the morning, Nayli got ready for work. She was offended by her son's behavior. To prove it, she had gotten up at the crack of dawn and decided to go to the university herself, though she was used to Matthew driving her. But principle and resentment were dearer. Nayli examined her guest's old-fashioned coat on the rack by the bathroom, then glanced even more squeamishly at the stale, dirty sneakers. Things in the hallway hinted that she was not noted for her tidiness, her limited means. The woman stepped over the stranger's shoes, deciding to wash the hallway with bleach upon her return, and left. The young men awoke almost simultaneously. Matthew saw through the doorway as Tiana timidly tried to find the bathroom. It was not without some awkwardness. Matthew, like a hospitable host, had even made breakfast. but it was made of sandwiches and tea early in the morning, when he himself dropped the unpretentious dishes. The sandwich landed sausage side down and landed on Tiana's pant leg with a piece of butter. The young people stared at the sad piece of salami on the plate for a few seconds, and then laughed. Matthew felt so relaxed and at the same time at ease with this girl that he hadn't even noticed his mother's absence from the morning. Of course, any awkwardness was gone from the conversation. "Are you on your way to the station?" he asked. They chatted like old friends who hadn't seen each other in years. Tiana had forgotten all about what had happened to her yesterday. It was sunny, just like this sunny city. She told her sudden companion about her childhood at her aunt's house, about how she liked to pick dandelion bouquets in the vegetable garden, about the time she was pecked by a rooster, about her first of her dictation. There was no sadness or longing in these stories, only carefree childhood and sincere delight of a child. Matthew listened eagerly, attentive to every word, absorbing these pure emotions, which he almost never got from his mother. With her commanding temperament, she was always dry, not praising, not encouraging, not interested in her son's dreams and discoveries. Nellie was preoccupied with the primary worldly tasks: food, regimen, studies, profession, finances. Matthew had enough friends. Teachers at school loved him. Girls were not shy to make eyes at him. But all this was a trifle compared to what this 19-year-old girl from the village told him today. With simplicity, purity, and trust. They waited for the train together, sitting on the platform. "Thank you very much." "I don't know how to thank you," Tiana said again with some awkwardness as she said goodbye. "It's okay," Matthew dismissed her. "But I do. Let's meet again when you get back and go to the movies." Tiana was a girl from the countryside who had come to the city. She met Matthew and a warm friendship developed between them. Matthew was charmed by Tiana's openness, spontaneity, and cheerfulness, something he lacked in his relationship with his own strict mother, Nellie. When Tiana was leaving, Matthew suggested that they meet again when she came to town and go to a movie. Tiana was happy at the prospect. Upon returning home, Matthew faced the displeasure of Nellie's mother, who considered Tiana a country wench and tried to get rid of any trace of her in the apartment with bleach. A conflict arose, during which Matthew for the first time openly confronted his mother, tired of her excessive control over his life. This situation highlighted the overdue contradictions between Matthew and his mother, Nellie. On the one hand, Nellie cared for her son, but at the same time she was overprotective and tried to impose her rigid attitudes on him. And Matthew, having met Tiana, felt a longing for freedom, lightness, and spontaneity in relationships. This story touches on the themes of growing up, gaining independence, the value of simple human joys, and the ability to assert one's boundaries even in relationships with loved ones. The clash of two life philosophies caused a generational conflict between mother and son. "I'm sick of your control," said Nellie. "I see you've picked up a lot of chutzpah from that hillbilly too." "Better chutzpah than a lifetime of being told what to do by someone else," Matthew said, and slammed the front door so hard that the figurines fell from the table. He slept in the car that night. Such loud arguments with his mother had never happened before. The boy had always held back or avoided sharp edges with cunning, but now something had been hurt that didn't want to put up with the insults. Tiana didn't tell her aunt what had happened. She said she was just visiting for a few days. The perceptive relative immediately noticed that her stepdaughter was unusually joyful. "But Tiana, tell me, did you meet someone?" Aunt Lexi asked at dinner. The girl burst out in surprise and dropped her spoon into her plate, splashing the table. Aunt Lexi laughed. "Ouch. You don't have to answer that. I can already see that I've met a handsome man." Tiana told her named mother about Matthew. "The main thing is that the man is good. You don't see much selfless help these days." Aunt Lexi patted her stepdaughter's shoulder approvingly. "Auntie, I don't think I'm right for him," Tiana said. "And anyway, maybe that's true. I was already dreaming of a house with a rose garden. And if you don't dream, then why live?" The woman was genuinely surprised. "You should have fallen in love a long time ago. In my childhood, there was only school, vegetable garden, chickens. I'm old, you'll be sitting on my neck." "But Auntie, don't say that," Tiana objected. "Who else but me will help you? Youth is for dreaming, for joy, for falling in love. And you are doing a great deal for me. Go and meet him, and I'll give you something to dress up." Aunt Lexi got up and went into her room. From there she heard the noise and creaking of an old closet. Soon the woman returned with 2 stud earrings. "This is what my late husband Alex gave me for my wedding in 1973. Ural emerald, a good luck stone." She placed the jewelry in the palm of the amazed Tiana's hand. The earrings were small, but elegant, even noble. The light green stone played in the sun, shimmering with facets. Aunt Lexi easily pushed Tiana to the mirror to try on the gift, and it was as if the jewelry was made for the girl. The emerald earrings looked even more beautiful against her brown hair. "Well, what's not a bride to be?" "Well done," Aunt Lexi said with a pat on the knee. Tiana laughed and took another sneak peek at herself in the reflection. That same night, Matthew called her himself. They chatted about everything and nothing. For about half an hour, the guy said he'd meet her at the train station. Also that he had a surprise. Tiana exhaled, awkwardly said goodbye, and went to bed, gazing dreamily at the fishnet shadows on the ceiling. Matthew did apologize to Nayli's mother for being rude when he cooled down. Still, the heated atmosphere in the apartment was hitting a nerve. It was amazing how Matthew had been practicing law at the university, operating with articles and laws, arguing with his professors, but he had been unable to defend his opinion to his mother until that day, because she had built her unquestionable rightness and authority into his head. Nayli listened to her son's apology and pretended to accept it too. But the coolness of the relationship betrayed the truth. Perhaps she was a little more critical of her son than usual, as if she were getting back at him for the offense. And he seemed impenetrably indifferent. About his studies, about cars, about passengers at work. Fears and worries. The invisible grit, he shook off his shirt and adjusted the collar of his coat. A worm of worry coiled inside Nayli. Had something changed? Whereas before she could confidently say she knew her Matthew from the get-go, now she couldn't. He was with her, and not with her at the same time. She'd been tempted to ask her son about her concerns several times, but she didn't know how to begin. The control she'd built her life around had been broken. The day of their second meeting was unusually warm for October. The sun was so hot that Tiana had taken off her cloak and was carrying it in her hands. Matthew even wore dark sunglasses, though he hid his eyes, which kept looking at the girl, her hair, her figure, her eyes, the polka dots on her blouse, the neat earrings. Every detail Matthew wanted to memorize and keep. In 3 days he'd missed her so much it felt like they hadn't seen each other in forever. "So what's the surprise?" Tiana asked, tucking an embarrassed strand behind her ear. Matthew nodded enigmatically and took her hand, calmly and confidently at the same time. In that gesture, all the worry, fuss, and concern dissolved. They walked down a long alley littered with yellow maple leaves and found themselves in a pet store. "Do you want to get me a hamster?" Tiana laughed. Matthew only smiled again. "Look here for a moment," he said, and disappeared behind the racks of aquariums. Tiana looked at the strange fish, the funny guinea pigs, and the noisy parrots. She liked the atmosphere, and she had always loved animals. She used to feed the chickens from her hands as a little girl, stroking their feathers, but they only clucked and looked into her face with their bird eyes. Tiana was distracted from her thoughts when through the bars she was playing with a parrot, as green as a young pea. "I see you've already got the hang of it. You've got the hang of it," joked a small woman in an apron with the store's emblem. "Hello, Tiana. My name is Olivia. Can it be Olivia? Matthew told me you were looking for a job." "Aunt Olivia is my best friend Alex's mom," Matthew explained. "And she'd love to have you if you'd like to work for her, of course." Tiana couldn't believe her ears with joy. Yes, I agree. I'm ready to start today," she blurted out. Olivia laughed. "That's the spirit. But today is not necessary. In 2 or 3 days, find a place to live, and then call me." She handed Tiana her business card, confused and happy at the same time. Matthew had a few words with the friendly pet store owner, and they walked out. "This is the second time you've helped me?" "I already feel very uncomfortable about it," Tiana said. The girl looked at Matthew. "I didn't do anything," she said, jokingly raising her hands. "A car brought you home to me, and Aunt Oberon took you to work." Of course she did. Tiana laughed and poked Matthew in the side with a finger of poorly hidden pride. Matthew whooped and laughed and immediately started tickling Tiana in return. They ran down the street like fools, one after another, giggling like schoolboys. Passers-by turned to look at the strange couple. But for them, the world gradually shrank to just each other. "Would you point your finger at me again if I said I'd help you a third time?" Matthew asked when they were out of breath. Tiana opened her mouth but said nothing. "Let's go somewhere," Matthew suggested. "And then we can go to the movies. I think we can make it in time." He looked at his wristwatch. 15 minutes later, the boys pulled up in front of the university dormitory. Matthew was friends with the head of the group, and he got along with the commandant. A small gift, a thank you envelope, a story about a poor relative, and he agreed to let the pseudo-student stay for a month or two. All the more so because Tiana's age was more than suitable. However, the commandant asked her to keep out of sight of the teachers and to come before 22. "Are you a wizard, honestly?" Tiana stared at Matthew as they walked outside with the room key. The boy scrutinized his chin and the back of his head, and then stated with a very serious look. "So no beard, like Hotabike. The magic hat is also missing. Verdict? No, I'm not a wizard." Matthew leaned over to Tiana and whispered conspiratorially. "Well, maybe a little." He made her laugh playfully and cleverly solved in one-day problems that took her weeks to solve. It was beginning to seem to her that the fairy tales her aunt had told her as a child were coming true. "Let's hurry." Matthew took her hand again, firm and gentle at the same time. "We have a movie starting in 20 minutes. It was one of the most joyous days of Matthew's life in recent memory. Yes, he'd skipped class today. Yes, he wouldn't go to work tonight. Yes, his mother would freak out if she found out. But why? Right now he feels needed and happy. And happiness is definitely worth a couple unattended lectures and a few missed passengers. Nayli tapped her pencil nervously on her desk. She had given the students an assignment. They sat like mice and wrote, while the instructor was lost in her own thoughts. 15 minutes ago, the department told her that Matthew had skipped class. He hadn't been in class before or after lunch. The helpful group supervisor had even asked Nayli if her son was all right. The woman threw something discreet in response, but inside her a mixture of resentment, frustration, and intense misunderstanding was slowly simmering. Matthew didn't pick up his phone and turned it off altogether. When had she not seen him treat her like that? So what if he became an adult? A mother should be respected at any age. She wants what's best for him to have a future, to become a powerful man, to make a name and a career. Where did it all start? Well, I guess it started with the unfortunate car. Yeah, that was a mistake. She let him, it was her own fault, believing a young man's good intentions. And now she's looking for him in that car. He's out of control. He feels he can do anything. So we've got to get rid of her as soon as possible. And Matthew can go back to being a good student and a good son. And if he wants to work, he can be a paralegal. You can't trust a man, even if it is your own child. She knows what's best. She's lived her life and managed to settle down well only because of her savvy, calculating, and pragmatic nature. So she can beat the crap out of a young guy's head. He'll thank her later, when his classmates are trampling the training ground in their boots. It's Daddy's bad blood. Nayli remembered her father. He, too, had been doing things during their short relationship. At first she'd even liked it, but then it became clear that without organization and discipline, nothing good would come of it. And a little later the beau made it clear what he really wanted. He was noodling about eternal love, encouraging Nayli to register him at her place. She couldn't let Matthew, whom she'd raised all her life, suddenly turn off the well-thought-out path. The weeds of excessive freedom, dubious girlfriends, and the like must be pulled out at the root. The chief accountant was distracted from his thoughts by a call from the class. The students hurriedly began to hand in their papers. Nayli didn't even glance at the stack of papers that piled up in the corner of her desk a couple minutes later. In her mind, she was already creating a plan to save her son and get him back on track. Matthew had come home in a light, uplifted mood, and that made the air sparkle. Nayli's mood was diametrically opposed. "Matthew, is there anything you want to tell me?" she asked, as soon as his son entered the kitchen and began to pour his tea. "No, Mom. Nothing yet he smiled radiantly at his mother from the other end of the kitchen. So skipping class isn't enough reason to talk. Naomi tried to hold back the outrage that was bursting out of her. Matthew's hand hovered in the air, a teaspoonful of sugar. He exhaled, then carefully poured the sugar into the cup and stirred the contents leisurely. Mom, I'm a grown man. If there are tales on my studies from my absence, I'll deal with them myself. Don't be so nervous. Naomi's calm, measured tone made her son's voice boil even more. Why are you embarrassing me? Do you want people to point the finger at me for having a truant son? No, Mom, you want to make a big deal out of nothing. One day of absenteeism is not the disaster you pictured. Matthew still spoke firmly and calmly, though it cost him some effort. For some reason, after talking to Jenny, he felt more mature, stronger, more confident. The weight that had been weighing on his shoulders since childhood and preventing him from objecting to his parent had dissolved into oblivion. With absenteeism, everything begins. Then women, then stupid adventures. Before you know it, you'll be without a diploma, without a profession, and without a decent place in life, Naomi said. Mom, stop making such a big deal out of it, please. Matthew sighed tiredly and rubbed his temples. The lightness and the wonderful impression of the day were gone because of this inane interrogation. Naomi, like a horse that had been yanked backwards at the most crucial moment, felt the invisible thread of her control over her son fleeing further and further ahead. Tell me, why did you skip your classes? The woman asked. I went to get my car repaired, Matthew replied. He realized that the truth would make his mother even more furious, so he said the first thing that came into his head. You think I can't see you're lying? Naomi threw the towel over her shoulder and put her hands to her sides. What car? I'm old, Matthew, but I'm not crazy. I've been fixing the car, the guy said expressively, separating his words with pauses. Give me the keys. Naomi demanded. I bought this car for you, and I'll take it back. What happened next broke some shudder in the woman's mind. Matthew silently pulled a bundle from his pocket, unhooked the alarm keys from it, and placed them in his mother's palm. Naomi stared at them stupidly somehow. The emotional army looked out from behind them confusedly, not realizing where the enemy had gone. Take it. Only you can't drive. That's one thing. Matthew began to curl his fingers defiantly. You can't sell it without the owner's signature. Me, that's two. In the end, your money, as you say, will rot in the yard, or will become the prey of car thieves when they find a car without an owner for several months. That's three. Naomi stared at him in amazement, gulping for air. Matthew calmly took the keys. Then he came very close and said quietly but seriously, Don't forget who I'm studying for, even if I occasionally skip classes. The guy took a mug of tea from the table and left the kitchen. The incident was over. The first stage of Naomi's plan had collapsed like a house of cards. She didn't like the job. For the first few weeks, she'd come to it as if it were an out-of-the-way place. Oberon marveled at how quickly the girl grasped everything and even did more on instinct. But the village childhood and her experience in caring for animals had its effect. Tiana quickly realized that she loved these hamsters, and what treats can only be given to parrots. In one day, she sorted through a warehouse of pet food. Then she cleaned 2 old aquariums to a shine which were dusty in the back room. Well done, praised her store owner. You can buy new fish if there is room. Tiana was not tired in the slightest. The work did not exhaust her as before. In the evening, she came to the dormitory, read books, or looked for information about her furry feathered charges on the net. She didn't want to collapse on the bed and fall asleep. This peculiar training has borne fruit. The customers listened to the girl enthusiastically. When they faced the choice of buying a pet, Tiana sat little mice in the arms of children, showed how to properly catch fish with a net from the aquarium, explained how to teach parrots to talk. Oberon could not be pleased with such a smart and diligent worker. Tiana herself was quietly pleased. She was afraid to rejoice loudly. Everything was going too well in her life. She was used to breaking through, climbing, gnawing her teeth with tears in her eyes. And her aunt said that there were plenty of envious eyes around, and they were not even necessarily acquaintances. That's how you rejoice, and some offended by life lady on the street spit and wishes you nasty things. So it is better to be quiet, but be sure that happiness will not go anywhere. The girl told me. How she had settled down. She unobtrusively asked about Matthew, but Tiana did not refuse. They saw each other 2 or 3 times a week. Matthew would stop by her place of work before his shift in a cab. They would sit in the corner of the store like a pair of canaries. Oberyn had once scolded Matthew for interfering with Tiana's work, but then waved it off, seeing the boys' glances at each other. Tiana hated to let him go every time, but she was afraid to say so. The range of emotions around Matthew was off the charts. She felt like a fool when he explained some historical facts with an important look. Then she was embarrassed and blushed. If he brought her goodies and small nice gifts, she sank in his eyes as in a cup of fragrant tea. Once he waited for her after the store closed. They drove around town all evening, and then Matthew handed her a neat bouquet. Never had any man treated her so simply and tenderly at the same time, not counting her aunt. But here was different. There was care, a twinge of shyness, a fear of offending, a desire to protect and shelter her under his wing. Tiana could feel it all without words. She'd once tried to start a conversation about thanking him for helping her with her job and housing. But Matthew put his finger to his lips and smiled. She was drawn to him more and more each day. When Tiana went to the village, she missed him especially. She wanted to put her arms around him, snuggle her nose into his chest and be silent. Smiling in love, she finally remembered that you can live and work not only for someone or for the sake of someone, but also just for yourself. Of course, Tiana never stopped sending her aunt money and worrying about her health. But for the first time, she realized that she could exhale and slow down a bit. That there were simple everyday joys, that you didn't have to run ahead, and sometimes you could even let yourself relax. October was over, and rainy, cold November came, followed by December. But not everyone was in the same gloomy mood. In Matthew's mind, the sun was shining all the time, whether he was in classes or driving to work. Time dragged on, but with Tiana, it flew by like a blink. His mother was behind him, or pretended to be. He didn't really care. Matthew didn't respect or love her any less. He just realized it was time to protect his personal space. Funny how it was only meeting the girl from the village that put things in perspective. Before, he had waited anxiously for his parents' approval and worried about her every no, even though he found an alternative. Matthew also realized that his mother would definitely not approve of his affair with Tiana. Not now, anyway. That's why he hid the girl's presence in every possible way. Why create unnecessary conflicts? When the time came, he'd introduce them for real. Toward the end of the year, every accountant is overwhelmed. You have to make reports, summarize all the documents, add up debit and credit. And, as is always the case, some certificates and forms were missing. Nayli had to send a couple of graduate students to lead the way, and herself to search for the necessary papers. She preferred to do everything in advance. There were enough examples around of those who procrastinated until the last-minute, sleepy students turning in their tails, and young professors cursing the university's bureaucratic system while trying to fill out all the journals in a day before an audit. Why do people have such a lack of respect for numbers? After all, you just have to start and everything in life goes according to plan. Someone will stop being late, someone will find out where most of their money goes, and someone will make an informed decision, Nayli thought. On their head, like a perfectionist, everything was in order. Accounting, Alex's student house. Matthew's shelf was empty. Outwardly, everything was the same, and she couldn't charge anything to her son based on maternal suspicion alone. But that same instinct told her that her son had changed. More precisely, he stopped listening to her. Break. All the shelves in the study. Nayli realized she had to go to the university dormitory. The necessary documents were bound to be there with the commandant. At first, Nayli had thought of sending a young assistant to the dormitory, but then something compelled her to go herself. And, as it turned out, for good reason. As soon as she came around the corner, she saw a familiar car in the parking lot in front of the dormitory. Matthew was standing next to it, reverently embracing a girl in an unremarkable gray jacket, but with a bright green scarf. The head accountant lurked around the corner like a detective. Then she took out her cell phone and snapped a couple of pictures. "So this is the mouse responsible for all my son's changes," the woman whispered, peering at Tiana through the panes of her glasses. At first, Nayli wanted to give her offspring a beating right there in the parking lot. But experience told her to be more subtle. She'd already kept more than one skirt away from her boy. It would be easy to deal with a skirt like that. Nelly even hid her face from all pictures of her son. It seemed to her the most disgusting prank. The woman waited until the couple had left, and with a determined look, she made her way to the commandant's office. First, I decided to get all the necessary paperwork, and then to nail the guardian of the peace of the dormitory to the wall with personal questions. I've got a truant student who lives here. I want to talk to her. Nelly began from afar as the papers were already in her bag. Whoever we find will be punished. The commandant, who liked to show off to the faculty on occasion, was keenly interested. True, this did not prevent him from covering student parties and absences for a small payoff. But here's the trouble. I don't remember the name and I've only seen it once, but here's a photo. Help me find this shameless one. Nelly shoved her phone under the commandant's nose, where Tiana's face was clearly visible. He turned up his nose predatorily, but then faltered, like a hound mistaking an empty tin can for a partridge. Not ours exactly, he shrugged. What do you say? Why don't you send an inspection down here? Have you had an accounting for a long time? And repairs. Nelly raised one eyebrow expressively. I'm a professional editor with a degree in philology and 20 years of experience. The commandant's eyes flickered. He was choosing the lesser of evils. Considering that some of the public property was written off, or sold, and the pipes and electrics were kept on duct tape and word of honor, he didn't need any inspections. To get the full because of the mess in the dormitory, or to get a little because of the lieutenant, the choice was obvious. But actually, said the commandant, she lives in room 302, but it is temporary, at the request of a relative from the village. Only then he realized that the girl in question could not be a student, which meant that she had not been truant. But it was too late. Apparently the law doesn't apply to you, said Nelly. Apparently an audit wouldn't hurt after all. The head accountant adjusted her glasses, turned to the door, and walked out. By evening, Nelly knew everything about Tiana: who she was, where she came from, what she was doing in the dormitory, and how she had gotten there. The story of a village girl with no education who was trying desperately to get a foothold in the city had set things straight. The woman realized that she was not wrong in her premonitions. She made a couple of calls and hung up the receiver of the working landline phone on the lever in satisfaction. Matthew looked at the time. It was almost 7 p.m. Tiana would be finishing work in half an hour. The young people agreed to go for a walk. The weather was just right. It was snowing without wind. The city seemed to be covered with a downy shawl. The guy took a couple of cups of coffee, Tiana's favorite chocolate, and went along a familiar route. But going into the store, saw instead of Joy crying girl and consoling her Oberon. Nothing, Tianushka, I can wait until you get settled again. The kind pet store owner stroked Tiana's back. What's wrong? Matthew rushed over to them, not forgetting his coffee, which he nearly spilled. Everything's gone. They evicted me from the dormitory. Tiana wiped away her tears. They said only students could live there. Well, why am I surprised? I'm the one who sat down. Matthew berated himself. You should have found another place to live a long time ago. Where's the stuff? Is it in the warehouse over there? Oberon nodded at the door behind the cash register. It's not your fault, Tiana said. I'm the one who got too relaxed. Let's go. Let's try to do something. Matthew took the bags from behind the door. Aunt Abby, if Tiana doesn't work for a couple of days, nothing will happen. Oh, come on, Matthew. The woman waved her hand. Well, I'm not human, am I? Of course I'll wait. Besides, you can't throw away such workers. Tiana looked at her employer with grateful eyes, and then at Matthew, who was already holding her jacket. Come on, Eagles, you've got work to do. Oberon admonished them before they left. The snow was still circling in the air, falling carelessly, dancing. Next to Matthew, Tiana immediately became calmer. He certainly wouldn't let her stay out at night. They got into the car, stowed their bags. We'll check into a hotel tonight, and tomorrow we'll find you an apartment, he said. But let's stop by my place. I think I left my car papers in my room. If the police stop me, I don't want to pay a fine. Sure, let's go. Tiana nodded and unconsciously hugged Matthew's arm. While they reached their destination, they called several hotels and very soon found a free and inexpensive room. They could exhale a little, As the car pulled into the driveway, Tiana's cell phone suddenly rang. She thought that it was the hotel receptionist, so she picked up the phone without looking at the screen. After a couple of minutes, the phone slipped out of her hands and fell on the seat. "What? Who called?" Matthew saw Tiana sit up with a determined face and saw her eyes fill with tears again. "Auntie's been taken to the hospital," Tiana muttered with wooden lips. "It was the neighbor who called the ambulance." Matthew pulled her to him and hugged her. "Why is all this coming down on you?" He stroked her hair and felt her shaking with sobs and tears. And Tiana was crying again, only out of helplessness. She had only just begun to believe in miracles as life brought her harshly back to reality. "Matthew, it's okay. It's going to be okay. Calm down. Let's go to your aunt's." "What hospital did they take her to?" Matthew started fumbling in the armrests. "In the meantime, have a drink. Tears won't help, but your eyes will hurt." He took out a plastic bag of pills and a bottle of mineral water. And then what they call a fatal accident happened. Tiana swallowed the pills and began coughing desperately. Matthew, in a panic, rushed to pound the girl's back and search for water around the car. But there was no more. He realized that just a little more, and they would have to go to the hospital for another reason. There was no choice but to go up to the apartment to get a glass of water. Matthew flew into the kitchen without taking off his shoes and immediately met the surprised gaze of Nayli's mother. All she could see was her son rushing back into the hallway with the hair dryer and the glass, and that there was someone coughing desperately. A few seconds later, the eyes of the unofficial mother-in-law and daughter-in-law met, the former's full of contempt, arrogance, and disgust, the latter's frightened and confused. "Why did you bring this here?" Nayli didn't even bother to call Tiana anything other than it. "Mom, can't you see? Is she sick?" Matthew stood up for his friend. "I see." The chief accountant wrinkled her nose squeamishly. "And she wants to get a better job at your expense." Matthew stepped between his mother and Tiana. "You've lost the last vestiges of your humanity with your numbers," he said, putting his back to the girl. "No, son. You've lost your mind." Nayli raised her hand and poked Tiana with her finger. "That girl's just a country girl. She'll move in, get pregnant, saddle you up in our apartment, and make money out of you." Tiana felt dizzy, whether from the fact that she could breathe normally at last or from the words of this scary woman hitting her like a rod. "I'd rather lose my mind with her than go on living with you on a leash," Matthew said, pulling Tiana close to him. Matthew turned his back to his outraged mother and hugged Tiana, who was trembling with shock. And out they went. To the hospital, the young people drove in silence. The girl no longer had the strength for emotions, and the guy was ashamed in front of her. In the hospital, Tiana barely made her way through the nurses to Aunt Ida's room. The woman was unexpectedly cheerful and was discussing something with another patient. "Auntie?" Tiana looked at her with a mixture of joy and bewilderment. The old woman went into the cellar and slipped on the last step. I went tumbling. Aunt Ida began to tell her story so contagiously cheerful that everyone present involuntarily smiled. I was sitting on a pile of potatoes. My leg was curled up. Somehow my neck, the crown, and the soup fell out. I got up somehow. Our neighbor went into the barn. I called out to her. And that's how I ended up here. "Oh, Aunt Ida. Do you know how to scare?" Tiana laughed and hugged the woman. "It's a sprain. They put a plaster cast on me, covered the abrasions with green, but left them." Aunt Ida nodded at the pile of papers on the nightstand next to Tiana's familiar mother. Tiana was immediately relieved. She was happy that everything had worked out. Neither lost housing nor nasty words could be more important than the love of those closest to her. Matthew's head poked into the room. He was tired of tramping down the hall. Come in, young man." Aunt Ida waved her hand invitingly, a little embarrassed. "Your guests. I've been wanting to meet you for a long time." Tiana introduced them to each other. In a couple of minutes, the conversation was already flowing animatedly. It was so easy and relaxed for all three of them, as if they were not in a hospital room, but on the veranda of a country house on a Saturday sunset. They chatted until the nurse asked the visitors to leave, as the time had passed 22. "We'll come tomorrow," Tiana promised. Come. Just the two of you," Aunt Ida winked at them both approvingly. When Matthew didn't come home the first night, Nayli had treated it as a whim. When Matthew didn't show up the second, third night either, Nayli began to worry. And when one day some of his things disappeared, she realized that the usual order had been broken. In the mind of a woman who had spent her life measuring by numbers, what had happened was incomprehensible. The unfortunate broken cup came to mind. On the fourth day, Nayli caught Matthew in the corridor of the university. "When are you coming home?" she asked him sternly but worriedly. "I'm fine," Mom Matthew replied distantly and coldly. "Don't be nervous." He pulled his elbow out of his mother's palm and headed off to his next class. Matthew and Tiana rented an apartment. A neighbor looked after the household in the village. There, in that tiny room of an old 5-story building, Matthew felt as cozy and good as he had never felt anywhere else. He already knew that this girl would definitely become his wife. Her inner world, her childlike directness, her marvelous sense of beauty charmed him. Her borscht cutlets could compete with restaurant dishes, and affectionate embrace in the evenings energized and relaxed at the same time. Tiana stopped by Aunt Lexi's hospital every day before work. Tiana had a fiancé. Aunt Lexi laughed. "What a fiancé?" Tiana waved away the beet-red Tiana. "I'm old, but I'm not bad." "I see that you both bloom like a flower on a May afternoon," the woman said good-naturedly, patting her stepdaughter on the head. Matthew smiled at the words, for they were true. When Aunt Lexi was discharged, the young men took her to the village. The elderly woman, limping but alert, joked constantly. From that day on, Matthew began going to see her with Tiana almost constantly. He liked the village atmosphere, the peace and tranquility. He had never had any relatives in the countryside, so everything was a wonder. The young man looked at the house and yard with keen interest, zealously brushed the snow, and constantly found something to do that required a man's hand. He changed the faucet, insulated the wiring, rehung the doors on the kitchen cabinets. Walk with the one, Aunt Lexi elbowed Tiana while standing in the hallway. "Tired of planting potatoes and digging beds in the spring," Tiana said. "I'd love to." Matthew crawled out from under the sink with a wrench, and Tiana laughed. Periodically, the couple's idyll in the village or in the apartment was broken by Nayli's phone calls. She asked Matthew to come back, shouted at him, threatened him, begged him, but the boy was adamant. Yes, it was hard to combine studying, working in a cab, and traveling out of town. On weekends, I had to deny myself something to pay the rent. But it was better than living under orders and constant control. "Mom, I'm fine." "Don't be so nervous," Matthew answered with the usual phrases without appealing to his conscience. Neither entreaties nor even tears could make him become comfortable and proper by his mother's standards again. In the end, Matthew began to be at home, but for a tick, and kept his new address a secret. He never refused help, but he kept his distance and continued to assert his personal boundaries. Nayli's anger was replaced by jealousy powerlessness, and it flowed into resentment. Colleagues said different things, who scolded the village girl, who suggested to get away from his son. But all agreed in one thing: at such a young age, so nervous will not do any good. Several months had passed since mid-April. Spring burst into town with cherry blossoms and the scent of the first daffodils. Nayli, though tired, could not fully accept the fact that her son lived apart. One warm day, when the sun was almost summertime, the accountant, returning from work, sat down on a bench in the lilac bushes. Usually Nayli never sat on it with her neighbors, considering it beneath her dignity to watch passers-by. But today her new shoes rubbed her foot, and she had no choice. Daniel, an elderly neighbor, came out of the entryway, leaning on a stick. He was a quiet old man who lived on the first floor, tended the flower beds, fed the birds, and never bothered anyone. "It's a beautiful day today," he greeted Nayli, lifting his old-fashioned hat. "Terrible. My feet are all blistered," she mumbled back. "My son's been on my nerves since winter. Work's a mess. It's not beautiful. Feet will heal. Work is not a wolf. And I can fix my son," Daniel shouted and went about his business. "He left his mother. Dumped her," Nayli grumbled. "I was like you when I was young." Nayli, the neighbor, suddenly changed his tone. "I also scolded my daughter for falling in love early. She married a tailor instead of a military man. Nelly, who had a lot of unfriendly thoughts swirling around in her head, suddenly had them scattering like sparrows from a bush. And nothing. She's graduated from the institute, teaches dancing to kids. Happy. Her eyes are shining. And now I'm happy about my granddaughter, Nelly. I took her to the circus when she was little. Now she's running from school with a certificate, Grandpa. She's all grown up now. Daniel sat down on the bench next to Nelly. What does this have to do with my son? She asked in bewilderment. It has to do with the fact that you have to let your children go in time, that you can't make a bed for them everywhere, so let them make their own mistakes and learn their own way. You want it better, but can he have it better in his head? The old man looked at Nelly carefully. How could he know? The woman began. The old man interrupted her and looked into her eyes clearly, but slightly sternly. Do you want to see your grandchildren? There was something in that look that made Nelly's inner rebel surrender, embarrassed, hide in a far corner. I do, she said, barely audibly. And if you keep fighting with your son, you won't see it. Daniel folded his hands on the hilt of his cane. It's about time he flew out of the nest and made his own. Is he a boy? Let's go. Nelly sighed. The elderly neighbor simply and without ceremony revealed the truth that she had feared all her life and did not want to admit that her son would grow up sooner or later, that he would not replace her husband. Life really isn't just about numbers and controlling every event around her. Nelly turned all suitors away, fearing they would take up her living space, and ended up alone. She drove the girls away from her son, and he still chose the one he liked. She did not spare even the students, even though they diligently studied her subjects and were afraid of absences. She only pointed, controlled, criticized, seeking to fill the void in her own soul. No matter how you look at it, it's a beautiful day. Daniel drew in air noisily and shouted happily, pointing to a tree. Look, a tit. He watched the bird with interest. Nelly nodded and smiled. The black and white bird hopped about the branches with a stick in its beak. At one point it dropped its find, made a loud squeak, and then flew to the ground, picked up the wand and flew away with it. Tiana and Matthew gathered in the village in the early morning of May 1st to help Aunt Lexi with chores for the holiday, cleaning up the grounds, planting vegetables. In the evening the plan was kebabs, baked potatoes, and a picnic. The young people had already left the house and were packing their bags with things in the car. Suddenly Matthew was called by a familiar voice. He turned around. Mom, how are you here? He was surprised. I mean, how did you find me? Tiana froze in front of the car. She was overcome by the echoes of that nasty feeling, when in winter she stood on the doorstep of a stranger's apartment and listened to nasty things about herself. Old friends helped, Nelly answered. I wanted to talk about everything that had happened. Her mother's voice was unaccustomedly soft, not dictatorial. There was a hint that she was holding them back. Or maybe it was something else. Mom, if you're talking about the same thing again, my decision hasn't changed. Matthew grabbed his bag of things. No, son, Suddenly tears came out of Nelly's voice and she began to wipe them away with her fingers. Tiana and Matthew were hurrying Tiana to get her out of her stupor, and Matthew because he had never seen his mother cry in his life. There were times he wondered if she was even capable of it. The boy hastily put his arm around the woman and began to soothe her. Don't cry, Mom, everything is fine. What's wrong? Oh, Matthew, son, I have so much to tell you. Nelly turned to Tiana, and to apologize to you. Come with us to the village. Matthew looked at his mother. We'll rest, we'll sit, we'll get to know everyone. It's a holiday, it's spring. He nodded to Tiana, and she tilted her head in agreement, showing that she supported the idea. Aunt Lexi took the unexpected guest's visit well. Tiana had never told her about what had happened between her and her chosen one's mother, so the acquaintance was easy and relaxed. Nelly and Aunt Lexi found common ground surprisingly quickly and began discussing recipes while sitting at a table in front of the porch. Matthew had pulled the table from the kitchen in anticipation of the evening's gatherings. The women tried to help the young men clean up the grounds, but they only waved their hands. Why are you staring at your mom like you're seeing her for the first time? Tiana nudged Matthew lightly with her elbow as they cleaned up last year's dry leaves and branches from the vegetable garden. I saw her for the first time. The young man leaned his gloved hands on the handle of the rake. Not a real one. How is this woman different from the one who all my childhood fed me porridge, according to the regimen, scolded me for being 2 minutes late? By evening, when all the pressing matters were over, the kebabs were fried and the table was set, the small group finally sat down together. Nayli, who had traveled light from the city, covered herself with a fur shawl. Aunt Lexi got the house wine, set out the best appetizers. She'd even laid a festive white tablecloth, which everyone had persistently discouraged her from doing. When, if not tonight, the stubborn hostess diligently straightened the corners and smoothed the pattern in the center. Tiana turned on the antique radio, which, like a grasshopper, stuck its long antenna whiskers out the window, and the chatter of the presenters and retro songs came on. The evening became especially soulful when it got dark, and some smooth melody played on the airwaves. Nayli suddenly rose from the table, glass in hand. "I want to apologize," she began, taking a deep breath. "First and foremost to you, Tiana. I behaved abominably. I apologize for my rudeness, my arrogance. I can see that my son is happy with you, and for any mother, that is what matters most." Tiana smiled with one eye at Nayli's mute question. As she continued, "I want to apologize to you, Matthew. I've tried to be the best mother for you, to replace your father and grandparents. But in this list of duties and discipline, I forgot about the simple moments of warmth, childhood joys, and your dreams. Forgive me, my boy." She discreetly took the napkin from her son's hands and blotted her wet eyes again. "Mother, you'd better stop it." "There's no need to apologize." Matthew took the woman's hand. No, I know what I'm saying," Nayli interrupted him. She looked at Aunt Lexi. "And I want to apologize to you too." "Why should I apologize?" The hostess splayed her hands, nearly knocking over the decanter. "To you and all the people who live in the villages. I always thought of them as second class, uneducated and stupid. I see now that I was terribly mistaken. It was only in my old age that I realized the blinders I'd been wearing all my life." Nayli exhaled and drank all that was in the glass in a gulp. "Oh, what a useless girl you are. We need a vegetable garden, and we have rattles in our hands." Aunt Lexi scolded her. "But since tonight is such an evening, I have something to say, too." Matthew looked around at the crowd. "The first news is that I've been hired as a paralegal. After the semester ends, I'm going to start practicing my profession. The second," he turned to Tiana, who was all animated with anticipation. For her, the news of the paralegal was indeed a surprise. But the real surprises were ahead. "Tiana." Matthew turned to her with his whole body. "I'd like to believe that a girl like you wouldn't give up the humble burden of being a lawyer's wife." That's how it happened that night. "Will you marry me?" Matthew asked. Aunt Lexi opened her mouth in surprise. Nayli let a second wave of tears fall, barely recovering from her loud apology. Tiana stared in amazement at the thin, dainty ring in a simple box. "I'll do it with the cab driver's husband," she exclaimed, jumped up and hugged Matthew tightly, not believing what was happening. After the hugs, congratulations, and toasts, they began a loud discussion about the upcoming wedding. Aunt Lexi said the celebration should be a village tradition. Nayli argued with her, insisting on a restaurant. Matthew intervened when the relatives got to the point of discussing the festive table. "No one is getting married yet. It's too early to plan hot salads," he calmly reassured them. "Women should plan ahead," Nayli replied. That's right, Aunt Lexi said. "What if I don't have enough pickles?" Tiana laughed out loud. Everyone else laughed too. It was past midnight when they decided to call it a night. Matthew took his mother into the house. Nayli was tired from the events, the long journey, and the revelations, so she fell asleep, barely touching her pillow. Tiana and Aunt Lexi were clearing the table. The woman suddenly froze as she carried the plates into the house. "What is it, Auntie?" Tiana asked, noticing it. "I told you that Pebble was good luck," sneaky Aunt Lexi said with a sly squint. "Now it's going to decorate the second wedding." Tiana looked at her reflection in the glass of the veranda, where her face was reflected in the bright lantern like a mirror. Her hair and earrings with Ural emeralds glistened. After selling her house in the village, Stacy reluctantly walked to her son's apartment, and when she saw the suitcase. Stacy walked down the street, struggling to move her legs. She had just returned from the supermarket where she had received her pension. The elderly woman went to the nearest grocery store. She needed to buy potatoes, some meat, and she was almost out of cereals. And also milk, flour, sugar. The bag was heavy. It hadn't been a weight for Stacy before, though. On the farm, she'd thrown hay with a pitchfork, carried huge boxes, and carried buckets full of milk or water. What a lot of things she'd done. But now Stacy was a little over 70, and age, of course, was taking its toll. Her back often ached, her arms weakened. She dragged the bag from the supermarket with great difficulty, slowly stopping every now and then to catch her breath. A couple of times she was offered help by passers-by and two teenagers with school backpacks on their shoulders. A middle-aged woman and a tall young guy also offered help. But Stacy refused with a smile. She was in no hurry to get anywhere. And these kind people, it was immediately obvious, were in a hurry to do their own thing. So why distract them? Stacy wasn't just walking so slowly because of the heavy bag. She just didn't want to go home, and the place she was going back to wasn't what you'd call a refuge. Her house used to be spacious, bright, cozy, with a large kitchen and a stove, 4 rooms with a front garden, and a carved fence that Stacy's father had put up, with beloved friends and neighbors. Close to home was good for Stacy, though her work was hard. She spent most of her life working on the collective farm, tending the animals and cleaning the pens. She worked double shifts to make sure her son had everything he needed. She would leave in the dark and return when the sun was already setting over the horizon. Her back ached, her arms and legs buzzed. Still, the old woman remembered those times with nostalgia. She felt much happier then than she did now. The November cold rain fell suddenly, without warning in Philadelphia, as if someone upstairs had opened a faucet of ice water. Stacy was in a hurry. The walk seemed to be canceled. She'd have to go home. There was nowhere to go. The rain was picking up and the wind was picking up. No, we can't run home, we have to wait it out. Stacy hurried to the porch of the nearest store. Here, under the canopy, she could stand until the rain stopped, and then she could go home. On the mischievous tiled plaza, people were gathered, cheerful children, for whom the sudden fall downpour was another adventure, and frowning adults, late for their business because of the rain. Stacy's gaze suddenly fell on a young boy. He stood with his back against the wall, staring blankly at the street. Bright birch eyes, sharply defined cheekbones, hair the color of ripe wheat. A real handsome man. He'd probably get a lot of girls. He looked just like Jacob, a guy Stacy had only known for 2 days in her life. That had been almost 40 years ago. And yet the older woman remembered every feature of the man's face, his scent, and the words he'd said to her. Jacob, if he was still alive, had long since forgotten his casual acquaintance. How many of those had he had? Young girls are attracted to good looks. Jacob has no idea that he has played such a role in the life of one of his many admirers. The key guy, the one Stacy was secretly watching, pulled his cell phone out of his pocket and stared at the screen, occasionally running his finger over the display. Whether he was watching a video or reading something. Young people are so dependent on these gadgets these days. Whether that was good or bad, Stacy didn't know. Her youth was very different. Stacy was born into a family of a tractor driver and a milkmaid. When she was only 2 years old, she became the oldest child. Her parents had another daughter named Vivi. The family lived poorly but decently. They did not starve, did not go in old clothes, and did not go to resorts. They did not buy fur coats and luxury cars. Their parents worked hard, so Stacy and Vivi learned early to help around the house. Stacy, observing modern children whom she thought were overprotective of their parents, marveled. She and her sister, at 7 or 8 years old, could already mop the floors, cook lunch and dinner. Moreover, the girls cleaned the yard, took care of the livestock, did their own homework and laundry without reminders. And after all, they did not have modern technical wonders that make life much easier: washing machines, dishwashers, and so on. The girls still had a lot of free time. Having coped with the lessons and finished their homework, the sisters with a clear conscience went to the street to their friends. All their peers lived the same way. They had time to do housework and at school and play with their classmates. Stacy and Vivi were always very friendly, supporting each other. Stacy has the fondest memories of her childhood. Then everything was simple, clear and easy. The future was seen in bright colors. Stacy didn't do well in school. Unlike her little sister, Vivi was a quick learner. Complex formulas were no problem for her. The complex rules of the Russian language seemed to fall into place in her younger sister's head. For Stacy, however, science remained incomprehensible throughout her schooling. She seemed to be trying to learn literacy. She always did her homework. She was not lazy. She did not slack off. But apparently the ability was not given. Vivi understood everything effortlessly. She just had a clear head. Parents were proud of their youngest daughter. Maybe someone from the family will get a higher education, dreamed the mother to get into the people. Daughter, reasoned the father, you have a head on your shoulders. It's foolish to miss such a chance. You do your best, and we'll help you. Stacy was proud of her sister too, but it hurt her to hear her parents say that. It turned out that her parents really hoped more for Vivi and expected her to succeed in her studies and career. They didn't count on Stacy for that. Vivi tried hard, studied hard, and never bullied her sister. On the contrary, she helped Stacy with her lessons. When Stacy was faced with assignments that were difficult for her, the sisters grew up. Stacy went to study in the city, went to college, choosing a specialty of sewing technologist. The girl has always had an aptitude for needlework. She realized that she would become a good tailor. Wright approved the choice of the eldest daughter's father. The specialty is wonderful. You will not be left without a piece of bread. You have golden hands. Agreed the mother. Bon voyage. After her studies, Stacy decided to stay in the city. She got a job in an atelier, rented an apartment nearby, started taking part-time jobs, and soon Stacy was supporting herself. The atelier paid a small salary, but the part-time jobs helped to make a dress, a coat, a tablecloth, or something else. Stacy did not sit without work and money. Meanwhile, Vivi was studying law at university. How proud her parents were of her success and told their acquaintances about it. For the eldest daughter, they were calm, hard-working. Stacy will not be lost. But they were really proud of their youngest daughter, Vivi, who was smart and beautiful, and was also studying at university. Stacy was genuinely happy for her sister. What could she do? She herself was not given to gnaw on the granite of science, but she had golden hands, and it was noted by everyone. As time went on, Stacy's friends were getting married, but it didn't seem to be working out for her. She wasn't attracted to the guys she liked, and for some reason the guys Stacy liked preferred other girls. When she heard about her friends' and classmates' weddings, Stacy worried that she might end up alone, an old maid. Her parents only added fuel to the fire, asking each time their eldest daughter arrived, when will she get married? When children? When will you settle down? Vivi's parents were in no hurry to get married. For one thing, she was the youngest daughter. As long as her older sister didn't get married, Vivi didn't have to worry about it. Secondly, she was still in school, and after graduation she was going to go to graduate school. Her parents saw her in their dreams as a university teacher or even a professor. From the eldest, Stacy, they just expected human happiness, to meet a cheerful, good-natured husband, to have favored grandchildren. Stacy was almost desperate. She looked at every guy in her neighborhood as a potential spouse and evaluated young people only from this position. Of course, such obsession did not go unnoticed and scared men away. Once there was a dance at the House of Culture. Stacy went there with her friends. She didn't like dancing very much, and loud music gave her a headache. But you could meet someone at the dance. Galia, her friend, found a husband there. They were living together now, expecting their first child. Stacy wanted the same, the love of a husband, a child, simple human happiness. She put on her best dress, tight, short, revealing her slender legs, curled her hair into curls, painted her eyelashes and lips. After looking at herself in the mirror and being satisfied, she slipped out of the house. Stacy didn't have much hope for anything, because she went to the dance once every 2 or 3 months and always came back with nothing. But that night was different, magical, amazing. Jacob had noticed one of Stacy's friends, Penelope, a blue-eyed beauty. He approached their company, seemed to be getting to know everyone, but kept his eyes on Penelope. Stacy realized she was missing. When she saw the stranger's turquoise eyes, merry, mischievous, and sly, and his smile that would drive anyone crazy, she fell in love. Jacob was witty and fun to talk to. He felt confident, not embarrassed, unlike so many of the other guys in Stacy's company. And she herself, of course, was mesmerized by him. Stacy envied Penelope. She wished that this young man was looking so interested in her and not her friend. She would have given a lot for that. But Jacob asked Penelope one dance, then another. Stacy watched them enviously from a distance. She saw the boy try several times to hold Penelope tighter to him than was proper. His hands kept slipping below her waist. Penelope, embarrassed, tried to pull away. Stacy didn't understand her. What was all this modesty and childish behavior? They were adults. They had already graduated. They were working. After another dance, Penelope slipped outside for some fresh air. Stacy understood that. She had been frightened by her beau's pressure, so she'd found an excuse to run away. Stacy had been watching the couple all evening and could see what was going on. Jacob hurried after his lady, but Stacy got in his way. Slow music was playing. "Shall we dance?" Stacy smiled at the boy. It was a desperate and bold move. Stacy had never acted like this before. But now it was as if someone was leading her by the hand. The girl suddenly felt relaxed, confident. There was no doubt in her mind that Jacob would agree to dance with her. And so he did. He stared at Stacy for a moment, as if trying to remember who she was. But of course, Jacob had only been looking at Penelope when he met her. He didn't care about the others. But the next second, he was smiling radiantly at Stacy, making her heart race and her palms sweat. And he held out his hand to her. They danced in each other's arms. Stacy melted in his warm embrace. When the music stopped, he even kissed the girl. Of course, it wasn't the first kiss in Stacy's life, but she had never had that reaction before. Stacy felt dizzy and her eyes darkened. She wished Jacob could hold her like this for the rest of her life. She didn't care if he kissed and hugged her in front of everyone. Let them watch, let them be jealous. And she didn't care what or who thought of her. "Why don't we go for a walk?" Jacob suggested in a slightly husky voice. Stacy was all for it. She wanted to be alone with him, too. They walked through the city at night, holding hands. Jacob said something about himself, then asked Stacy questions about her life. When he learned that she lived alone, he offered to go to her. Stacy agreed without hesitation. In the evening and at night, Stacy played a very pleasant role for herself. She imagined that she and Jacob were husband and wife who loved each other and were going to live together for the rest of their lives. It was a pleasure to be near this man, to take care of him. How happy was it to fall asleep next to the one she loved? Jacob was already asleep, but Stacy lay there, staring at the ceiling, savoring the warmth of a loved one. His peaceful breathing, the silence, the stillness. Just the two of them. Magical. Stacy realized she was in love like she had never been in her life. She never knew she was capable of such feelings. Stacy didn't know much about Jacob. He told her he lived in another city. Which city, he didn't mention. He'd tell her tomorrow. Guy came here to visit a friend. They were in the army together. This coworker had a wedding recently. So he invited Jacob. Witnesses like Jacob's leaving soon. But now everything's changed. They've met each other. Jacob isn't going anywhere, and if he does, he'll probably take her with him. The way he'd been looking at her all night. Those looks were the spark that had ignited between them, and that rarely happens. How lucky they were to meet each other at the dance. In the morning, Stacy woke up to someone rattling pans in the kitchen, but caught the scent of scrambled eggs. Stacy stretched in bed and smiled, remembering the events of the previous evening. It's Jacob. He's making them breakfast. How wonderful and romantic this is. Before meeting her lover, Stacy peeked into the bathroom. She washed her face, lightly brushed her hair to look casual, touched up her lipstick and lightly pinched her cheeks, causing a blush. She wanted to look her best in front of Jacob. He'd made her scrambled eggs, and there was ham frying in the skillet. "Good morning," he smiled. "I've been tending to your place for a while. Nothing, I was just hungry." "It's for the best." Stacy smiled radiantly. Breakfast almost in bed. How romantic. "Why don't you come on? I'll take care of you." Jacob took out a plate, deftly placed a piece of scrambled egg on it, and sprinkled greens on top. Stacy watched his every move as if mesmerized. Her heart beat joyfully in her chest. She had finally met her man. And what a man. Beautiful, intelligent, attentive, caring. They ate breakfast in silence. Jacob seemed pensive. He was obviously thinking about something, and Stacy didn't want to distract him. "Thank you for tonight," he finally broke the silence. "I have to go. I have to stop by Layton's, pack my things, and get to the train station. The train's coming." Stacy felt like she'd been hit over the head with a sandbag. How come? Is he leaving already? What about her? I mean, they're so happy, so cozy together. "Are you leaving already?" she asked in a distressed voice. "Didn't I tell you?" Jacob was surprised. Then he smiled his charming smile. "Yeah, well, we didn't have much to talk about last night." "I thought you were staying," Stacy admitted. "I would have." "You're great, aren't you? But the train's in 3 hours and there's a lot to do. We'll see each other again." Stacy struggled to keep the tears from coming to her eyes. She'd already figured it out from Jacob's look and his tone. It was an illusion, their feelings and sparks. The situation that Stacy and Jacob found themselves in was fairly typical and common. They obviously had different expectations for this encounter. For Jacob, it was an easy one-night adventure with no commitment. He was honest and didn't intentionally deceive Stacy. He just didn't specify all the details because of the romantic atmosphere. On the other hand, Stacy fell in love very quickly and began to build illusions about a serious relationship and a future together. She herself invented a beautiful love story, although Jacob did not promise anything like that. When the truth came out, it was a painful disappointment for Stacy. But she'd done the right thing, not to make a scene, but to keep her dignity. Jacob had been good in his own way too, apologizing, explaining the situation, and not making empty promises. In this kind of casual romance, it is important to be sober about the situation and the expectations of both parties. Avoid naive illusions and do not build air castles. But if feelings have awakened, do not be ashamed of them or suppress them. The main thing is to maintain respect for yourself and your partner. Accept the situation as it is. Extract from it a positive experience, not bitterness of resentment. Life goes on, and new love adventures and meetings may be waiting ahead. The situation Stacy finds herself in is indeed a difficult one. An unexpected pregnancy after a casual liaison puts before her a difficult choice, on which her whole future life depends. On the one hand, she dreams of motherhood, and at her age this may be her last chance to have a child, plus a child from a man for whom she had warm feelings. Igor has shown himself to be an attentive and caring man, albeit for a short time. On the other hand, Jacob is clearly not expecting and not ready for fatherhood after a fleeting affair. Raising a child alone will be very difficult, both morally and financially, and the pregnancy itself in her position a great stress. To make a decision on abortion is also not easy. In addition to ethical worries, it can negatively affect health and further fertility. In such a situation, it is very important to soberly consider all options, listen to your heart, but also objectively assess your strength and capabilities. Consult with close people who can support. And having made a decision, do not torture yourself with doubts and guilt. No matter how difficult the situation may be, life goes on. Perhaps in the future Stacy will have the opportunity to become a mother under more favorable circumstances. Or maybe this experience will help her better understand her true desires and priorities. The main thing is to move forward, drawing strength from her informed choices. Stacy had never met one before at all. She couldn't think of a better candidate for fatherhood. No, of course, Jacob won't be involved in the baby's life. He wouldn't even know he existed. No way. They'll never meet again. And yet, such a heredity. If the baby turns out to be as beautiful, it's a dream come true. Stacy felt she couldn't get rid of the baby, even with the hardships that threatened her. The fate of a single mother is unenviable, but it's better than being all alone. Having no children at all is even worse. In general, Stacy hesitated for a while and then made a difficult decision for herself. She leaves the child and will try her best to give the baby a good childhood. She has a profession. Parents, in case of anything, will definitely help. They are loving, reliable. So the baby will be. The decision has been made. Stacy felt inner peace and began, at last, to really enjoy the life, rapidly developing under her heart. At this time, Vivi, the younger sister, had finished graduate school and received her degree. Not only that, she was invited to work overseas for a large company doing research. This was something incredible in Stacy's eyes. Vivi, her little sister, had made it to such heights. A dizzying career, interesting work, recognition awaited her. And she, Stacy, would soon be a single mom. Her parents talked of their youngest daughter's impending departure. They were proud of her, proud of Vivi again, and had no idea that their eldest daughter would soon make them happy that she was about to become a single mom. Against the backdrop of her sister's success, for which Stacy was certainly very happy, her own life seemed a complete failure. Vivi drove away. She called her parents and sister, occasionally sending letters with pictures in them. Vivi had changed. There was a hardness in her face that made the girl even more beautiful and attractive. Beautiful, smart, just a dream. And Stacy had her own life going on. A few months passed, and it was impossible to hide the pregnancy. At work, they figured it out. The boss wasn't particularly happy that one of his seamstresses was going on maternity leave. Now he was nagging Stacy about her work and kept insinuating that she wouldn't be welcome at work because a single mom would be taking sick leave all the time. Who would have to work then? All of this was unsettling to Stacy. She understood that the case is going to be dismissed because the labor code carefully protects pregnant employees. But there are always loopholes, so the boss found one. One day he simply closed the attire, terminating its existence. Accordingly, all female employees lost their jobs, but only for one day, because the firm went bankrupt only on paper. In fact, it continued to function without stopping. The very next day, the boss took the dressmakers back to their old jobs. All except Stacy. A pregnant employee and then a single mom with a small child were of no use to the boss. Stacy was out of work and destitute. She had no savings. She couldn't even pay her rent. Nowhere to go. Stacy had to go back to her parents in the village and confess everything to them. Her mother and father were surprised to hear her daughter's story, but not particularly upset, even seemingly on the contrary. "Do not worry, we'll get through," her father soothed, stroking Stacy's head like a little girl. "We won't fall through. It's not those times. We'll be fine," echoed the mother. "You have a baby, we'll help raise it. Children are happiness." Her parents didn't seem bothered by the difficulties ahead or the inevitable gossip from the neighbors. Stacy understood why this was the case. They had a successful youngest daughter. Even Stacy's life mistakes paled in comparison to Vivi's accomplishments. On the one hand, it made life easier for the mother-to-be, but on the other hand, it made her feel even more ridiculous and stupid. As always, against Vivi's background, Stacy was losing badly. Frustrating, painful, but familiar. At the due date, Stacy's son Ben was born. The new mother spent hours looking at his red, wrinkled face, trying to see if he looked like Jacob. She wanted him to look like his father, to be as handsome, as charming, as charismatic. It didn't work. Ben didn't have those deep birch eyes or the open smile that made his cheeks dimple. Ben was just an ordinary boy, short, skinny, black-haired, like his grandfather. Stacy was a little hurt that her son hadn't inherited his father's good looks. But it didn't affect her feelings for the little boy in any way. Stacy adored Ben. The first time she saw her baby, she realized that from now on all her actions, all her life would be only for his sake, for the sake of this little man. While Ben was a baby, Stacy was supported by her parents. How could they not? Government payments are minimal, no husband, no savings, no job in sight. Who wants an employee with a baby in her arms? So the parents fed both their daughter and their adored grandchild. Stacy didn't want to be on their backs, so as soon as the opportunity arose, she took a job as a farm laborer. Ben was too young for kindergarten. He was left in the care of his grandparents. They were very fond of him. But Stacy decided to work. After all, her baby needed the best toys, the best clothes, the best travel. She accepted that Ben was growing up without a father, but the boy should not be in need because of his own mother's carelessness. The work was hard and physically exhausting. To make a good living, she had to work double shifts, but at least Stacy had money. Now she went into town with Ben every weekend. They sat in cafes, went on rides, went to the movies, and of course visited toy stores. Stacy often let her son choose what he wanted: expensive radio-controlled cars, imported construction equipment, huge sets of soldiers. Stacy literally bent over backwards at work for this, but most importantly, the happy gleam in her only child's eyes. "Why do you shake your head sometimes?" Dad asked. "You can't do that. Everything is for Ben. You forget about yourself. And you're still young." "I don't want anything," Stacy shrugged. "I just want my son to be happy." "Son, it's time you taught him to work," teased his father. "He doesn't clean up his plate or his room." The grandmother objected. "You do everything for him." "Spoiled the boy. It's not good for him. It's not good for a man." No, Stacy's mother intervened. "A loving grandmother will still have time to teach him to work. Let him enjoy his childhood for now." Stacy fully shared her mother's opinion and supported her. Her father just waved his hand at the women's arguments and silently went outside. Sometimes he would say something like, "Can't you argue with me?" Stacy was annoyed by her father's behavior at the time. It wasn't until a decade later that she realized how right he was. Blinded by her love for her only son, Stacy hadn't seen or noticed much. Now they're reaping the rewards. Ben grew up a bright but lazy boy. At school, he'd grasped everything quickly at first and was an excellent student without much difficulty. Stacy hoped he'd taken after his Aunt Vivi. She already held a position in the scientific academy, published in journals, and was almost a celebrity, at least in scientific circles. But it is impossible to ride out all the school years on one cleverness and memory. It was time to work, to teach, to delve into complex formulas, to make an effort. That's what Ben didn't want to do. And the problems began: twos, absences, unwillingness to go to this stupid school at all. Ben gave a lot of arguments for the fact that in the modern world a person can get a good job without education. And Stacy's heart was bleeding from the fact that her son was wasting his abilities in such a stupid and talentless way. The strict grandfather tried to educate his stubborn grandson. This time the mother and grandmother did not interfere with him, kept aside. But it was too late. For Ben, there were no more authorities. The boy got mixed up with a bad bunch of teenagers from dysfunctional families. Stacy talked to her son a lot, tried to call him to order, but it was all in vain. Ben was convinced that he knew best how to behave. "But what can you teach me?" he questioned his mother. "You live in poverty. You have no education. All your life you worked on the farm for pennies. Your parents should have brought you up." By example, you know. "I don't want a life like yours," Ben said to Stacy's mother. "Your example wasn't a good one. There are other ways." Stacy had nothing to say to her rapidly growing son. All she could do was hope that he would be all right, that he would grow up and wise up. The year Ben was to graduate from high school, Stacy experienced many losses. First, just after New Year's Eve, her father passed away. He'd long had a strange cough and difficulty breathing, but he'd written it off as a lifelong smoker. It turned out to be his heart. The heart attack happened in the morning. The ambulance didn't even make it to the hospital. After his grandfather's death, Ben went wild. The man, though elderly, had kept him in check. Now it's like he's got no brakes. He could disappear nights with new friends, come home drunk and demand money from his mother and grandmother for entertainment. Ben became rude, abrasive, a total stranger. Neither persuasion nor threats worked on him. Stacy, who was still longing for her father, felt she was losing her son. And only his mother gave her hope with her words that the boy was mad because he was growing up at that age, without a father. "The boy is difficult, nothing to him. He will soon calm down." "I have seen a lot of such cases in my life," said the grandmother. And indeed, by the middle of the year, Ben had suddenly grown up sharply. He had just graduated from high school, had received his certificate with C's, and he had received his grades only for his past merits, and that was thanks to his mother, who at the end of the year ran after the teachers and the school administration with gifts. Ben seemed to appreciate that his mother and grandmother had done a lot for him, and even apologized to them. Stacy's heart sang with joy. Mom had been right. Growing up, Ben changed. "I decided to go to City College to be a welder. It's a great trade," he announced. His mother and grandmother approved of his choice. They would have been happy with any decision Ben made. The main thing was that the boy realized the importance of education. Ben would learn, he would get a profession, he would have a good, settled life. He left without difficulty, went to college, started an independent life in a college dormitory. Stacy breathed a sigh of relief. Everything seemed to be falling into place. And then another blow hit. On New Year's Eve, the elderly Vivi fell ill. Fever, cough. No big deal, just the usual seasonal cold. Stacy nursed her back to health, but her grandmother got worse and worse. They called the doctor. He immediately heard wheezing in her lungs. Vivi was admitted to the hospital with a diagnosis of bilateral pneumonia. Stacy was scared, of course, but pneumonia is a serious thing. Only Grandma is in the hospital, under the care of doctors. Stacy didn't think anything bad, but one morning she got a call from the hospital with the terrible news that Vivi was gone. During the night, the seizures began. In just 1 year, Stacy had lost both parents, her support, her reliable rear end. It seemed to her that she had been knocked out from under her feet. She was left alone with this cruel world, with a complicated life and a difficult teenager, Ben. How she wished now that Jacob, the father of her child, was there. Yes, she still remembered him fondly and lovingly. Stacy needed a solid shoulder to lean on in this difficult situation. But there was no such person, there just wasn't. Vivi was far away. Sure, she would come for a while to say goodbye to her mom. But she'd go straight back to her vibrant, eventful life. And Jacob, of course, wouldn't remember Stacy anymore. I wonder how his life turned out. Surely he is happily married, raising his children, not even realizing that somewhere there is another son, so in need of attention and care. Time passed. Stacy was adjusting to her new life. The son went to study in the city. The woman still worked double shifts to make sure Ben had everything he needed. Ben needed clothes, food, textbooks, and extra classes. The young man still needed to go out and have fun after all. It is the time of college, when, if not now. And life in the city is not cheap. Her son wasn't working yet, so Stacy did her best for her only child, bending her back and transferring most of her paycheck to Ben. Doesn't she need much? But for Ben, whose life was just beginning, Stacy wanted to provide everything he needed. If you brought a man into this world, you'd better provide for him. It was oddly dreary to be in an empty house. No one to discuss the news of the day with. Ben, of course, was called almost every night. He answered his mother's questions that he was fine, always in a hurry. It was understandable, being young. Stacy took no offense, but she often felt lonely and abandoned. Edward, a former classmate who was already a widower, began courting Stacy during this period of her life. He worked as a driver for the administration. Once upon a time, Edward had chased Stacy with flowers and compliments. It was back in high school. Funny, Stacy recalled, insecure, ridiculous, kind of anxious, but touching. Back then, young Stacy had dreamed of guys like Jacob, handsome, stylish, smart. And Edward, he was too plain, ethereal, puny, and wearing glasses. Of course, Stacy was pleased by the boy's attention. It flattered her ego, to be sure. But anything serious with him was out of the question. Time passed. Edward had grown from a teenager into a rather attractive man. He married a girl a grade below him, Trixie, whom Stacy had been friends with as a child. They weren't close friends, but they often hung out together, talking, sharing secrets. Edward and Trixie's family was exemplary. They were both quiet, hardworking, polite. It was hard to imagine either of them raising their voices at their spouse or children. Stacy was happy for her childhood friends. Edward and Trixie had a son and a daughter. They raised their children, worked, flew to the sea every summer. Full house, affluence, love, prosperity. Stacy looked at this happy couple with a smile, and was happy for them, and a little envious. That was the kind of family she wanted to have, preferably with Jacob. But it hadn't worked out. Except that Edward and Trixie's happiness had been short-lived. Young and seemingly healthy Trixie suddenly began to wither. She was literally melting away. She became thin, weak. Edward took his wife to hospitals trying to help her. The cause, of course, was found some complex genetic disease had debuted. But the doctors just threw up their hands and gave disappointing prognoses. There was no help. As a result, Edward was left alone with 2 children in his arms. True, his son and daughter were already old enough, but still the whole village supported the inconsolable widower. Stacy even cooked dinners for the orphan family. And then the man pulled himself together and took care of the household himself. So slowly he raised the children, put them on their feet, educated them. Both of them were already working and living in the city. Edward was in no hurry to move closer to his children. His elderly parents were still in the village, so he looked after them. When Ben left for school, Stacy began to notice that Edward was around more and more often, walking her home after work, chatting about this and that, or helping her carry her bags from the store. It was as if he was accidentally in her way. Stacy didn't mind this pleasant company. They talked about the news, reminisced about their childhood, laughed. One day she invited Edward to tea. He met her after work, as was his custom, and walked her to the gate. The man agreed and came in. Finally, Edward decided to have a serious conversation. It was obvious that he was not taking this step lightly. "Stacy, I've always liked you, you know," he said. "Well, when was that?" Stacy smiled. She hadn't realized what Edward was getting at then. It seemed to her that they were just reminiscing about their childhood again. It had been a long time ago, hadn't it? Edward agreed. Then he looked at her seriously and added, "But nothing had changed since then." Stacy looked at the man questioningly. She didn't know what to say. But the sensation of this unexpected confession was clearly pleasant. It sent shivers down her spine and warmed her heart. "I've had a crush on you since I was a kid." Since the 6th grade, Edward continued. "I decided to admit it in high school. And then I backed off. I pretended I didn't care, but I didn't, and I didn't. And the truth is, I was in a lot of pain. I used to sneak looks at you, admire you. I'd get jealous if any of the guys were around. And I dreamed that when I graduated from high school, I'd get rich and come after you in a cool car. Then you'd pay attention to me." Stacy smiled. The confession seemed naive and sweet. She hadn't noticed anything. Edward smiled too, remembering his young, ambitious self. "But it didn't work out," the man continued. "I couldn't get into university. I didn't have enough brains. I studied to be a driver and returned to the village. Of course, I found out about you. Some acquaintances told me you lived in the city. They said you had someone. Well, I didn't doubt it. Such a beauty. How could you not have fans lining up? I bet they did." Stacy couldn't take it anymore and laughed out loud. "Edward, living here in the village, thought I was a horde of suitors. I was lonely and jealous of my married friends. Oh, you don't know how wrong you were." "Yes, I was a young fool." Edward grinned. "Anyway, I decided that the train had finally left." "Edward, you were under the illusion that I had a rich fiancé in town and tons of admirers. In reality, I was lonely and jealous of my married friends." "You're in town, and you have a rich fiancé who lavishes you with gifts," Edward said bitterly. "I should have checked, and I suffered and felt my own inadequacy. Who was I? Just a driver. And you're a princess? A queen, an unattainable ideal. No match for me." Edward was in almost physical pain at the time. The girl he had been in love with since childhood would never be his. At the time, it seemed like there was nothing to live for. The guy worked and ate, went out with friends. The world was somehow gray and faded. Everything seemed meaningless. And then it suddenly became clear that the neighbor's daughter Trixie was attracted to him, to Edward. It was an amazing discovery for the boy. Someone could love him for who he was, not too pretty, not too successful. Anya had gone from a skinny girl to a lovely young woman. Big clear eyes, thick long hair, thin waist. Trixie graduated from a teacher's college in the city and returned to her hometown. She was now teaching school, tutoring first graders. She walked briskly toward Edward that evening, returning from work. She caught up with her neighbor at the gate and told him to his face how she felt. "I was stunned," Edward recalled with a smile. "It was unexpected, and I felt sorry for her. I'd been in the same position myself. I knew how hopeful she was, how important my attention was to her. And I knew how much my indifference would throw her off. How could I do that to a fragile girl in love?" Anyway, Edward and Trixie started dating, getting to know each other better and realizing every day that they were a great couple. "I thought nothing good was going to happen in my life," Edward said. "It was as if Trixie had pulled me out of my cocoon, showing me that happiness was still possible." Edward and Trixie married and had children. "And then? Then you came back to the village, Confused and pregnant, Edward said to Stacy, "How I wanted to be there for you, to support you. But it was too late. We were married, and we had babies. Did you still love me then?" Stacy wondered. "Of course I did," Edward answered. "I still do. But I couldn't show my feelings then. I already had obligations to Trixie and the children. I loved all three of them very much, and I couldn't betray my family, not even for my own happiness." "Were you unhappy?" Stacy asked in surprise. Edward's revelations had shaken her to the core. "I couldn't say. Trixie was wonderful. I loved her in my own way, took care of her. I was good to her. But with you, even now, I can't describe how I felt and how I feel." They sat for a while longer. Edward stared at Stacy, waiting for some sign from her. She didn't understand her own feelings. She was pleased that there was someone who loved her so much. It made her feel warm. After the death of her parents, Stacy was left all alone, a son in town, a sister abroad. There were no people who cared about her, who tried to please her, who were interested in her well-being. And then there was Edward. In love, devoted, good, reliable. But something was stopping Stacy, Ben. How would he feel about this turn of events? He'd probably disapprove, say her mother had gone crazy and was having an affair in her old age. Only the desire to be with someone she cared about gradually overcame her doubts. Stacy often thought about how nice it would be if they lived together. Edward would be happy, that was for sure. And it felt good to know that you could make someone so happy. Anyway, that night, the former classmates decided to try to become a couple. "I'll ask you out tomorrow," Edward summarized with a smile. "The dream of my youth would finally come true." "It will come true." Stacy nodded like Trixie's wife. The next day they went into town. They wandered through the park, talking, sitting in cafes, and then they went to a movie theater. Edward took Stacy's hand during the movie and held it for an hour and a half until the movie was over. The woman didn't mind, she liked the feeling. She was finally not alone. A week later, Edward moved in with her. He fixed the leaky faucet and tightened the hinges on all the interior doors. They were finally squeak-free. And Stacy started cooking for herself again. She was too lazy to do it alone, but now Edward was with her, and she was making him happy with delicious meals. The only question on Stacy's mind was how Ben would feel about all this. He didn't know yet, did he? His son rarely came to visit his mother, and they talked on the phone more and more. She had been stalling, not telling Ben about the changes in her life. Edward had told both his son and daughter at once. Stacy realized they were happy for their father. She wished her own son would react the same way, but there was little hope of that. Several years passed. Stacy still hadn't decided to have a serious conversation with her son. Hiding the details of her personal life wasn't difficult. The son had little interest in what was going on with his mother. He usually only called to ask for money. But one day, Ben came to visit. It was surprising. The son hadn't graced his mother with his presence for a long time, and now he showed up. Hi, Stacy was both excited and a little confused. Edward hadn't come home from work yet, but his things were everywhere. It was impossible to ignore the fact that someone else was living in the house now. Hi, Ben said glumly. He didn't look well, gaunt, pale, anxious. I need money, he said. Stacy knew right away that something serious had happened. What's going on? She asked, clutching at her heart. Something stabbed in her chest. Is it something with school? I haven't studied in a long time, Ben muttered under his breath. How come? They expelled me for truancy. I've been working hard and you don't get any money, he said rudely. I sent you most of your paycheck every month, Stacy reminded him. That's good money for the city. It's nothing, Ben sighed. I didn't have enough. So I did the best I could. Other people's parents are well-to-do. They have cars and apartments and money for fun. Did I feel like a beggar all the time? You think that's nice? It hurt Stacy to hear those words. She'd worked her whole life for her son. She wanted Ben to have the best of everything. And now this is what happens. He thinks he's miserable. So Stacy's not doing her job as a parent. Ben even dropped out of college. So what now? Stacy asked. Did he go into debt? I wanted to start a business, make some money, Ben explained. I ended up in debt. They're charging me a lot of money. They're threatening to kill me. Where am I going to get it? So I came to you for help, Mom. You know I ain't got nothing. What do you mean you don't have anything? Ben was surprised. What about the house? Do you want us to sell the house? Well, what's the solution, Mom? I'll pay off my debts and rent an apartment. We'll live in the city. Why are you going to take a well-deserved vacation soon? There's no couch in town, of course. But I'll get you a job in an attire. My grandmother told me that you used to be a seamstress, and now this labor pays well. We'll live together in town, like we used to. Wouldn't that be nice? Stacy couldn't agree with her son. A couple of years ago, she would have happily supported Ben's idea. Living alone in an empty house was unbearable. But now she had Edward. They were good together. It was nice to have someone who loved and understood. And now what? Ben finally noticed the men's things in the rooms. Edward's jacket hung on the wall, his pants were on the table. There were size 43 sneakers by the front door. What are those? Ben asked, looking at his mother in amazement. Did you have someone in your life? I've been wanting to tell you for a long time, Stacy said. It's just something that happened here. Ben nodded his head understandingly and sighed sadly. My personal life is getting better. Yeah, well, of course you don't have a son to worry about. You know I'm not. Stacy objected softly. She could see that Ben was depressed and in trouble. He needed help, and she, the mother, would certainly lend him her shoulder in his time of need. Who else would? Son, I'll do whatever you say. And Stacy did. She sold the house, gave most of the proceeds to her son. With the rest, she bought a tiny apartment in an old house on the outskirts of Los Angeles. Edward offered options, wanted to give Ben his savings. It was less than he needed, but it was still a decent amount. Stacy didn't agree. Edward shouldn't have to solve her problems. Their problems. He had children of his own. Using a man in a situation like this is despicable. Stay with me, Edward asked Stacy. You're packed, your suitcases are waiting for tomorrow morning. Ben has ordered a cab for you by 10 o'clock. You know I can't, Stacy replied. I know, but I don't understand. You gave him money, you bought him a place to live. But why would you want to be there yourself? Stay with me. I've got a big house, plenty of room, you know. We had a good time together, didn't we? We were, agreed Stacy. Yes, in the few years she'd lived with Edward, the woman had grown accustomed to warmth, to caring, to understanding. It was very pleasant. They walked together in the evenings, discussing things. Edward looked at Stacy with loving eyes, and she felt happy. But now everything was different. Stacy could see that her son was not well. Too anxious, too restless. Something bad is clearly going on in his life. Yes, Ben is an adult, and Edward is partly right when he says he should be able to deal with his own problems. But when Stacy was in a difficult situation, she didn't deal with her problems on her own. Stacy's parents had helped her a lot in the past. Edward assured her that this was a different story. A young, single woman with a baby in her arms and a grown man who'd been given money from the sale of her house by her mother. Stacy couldn't agree with him. It's fine for him to talk. He's got both his son and his daughter graduated, working good jobs, with families. There was no telling how Edward would behave if one of his children was in a situation like Ben's. Stacy was also afraid of losing her last place to live. Now that she didn't have the house she'd spent her childhood in, she was beginning to worry about growing old. It wouldn't be long before she would be elderly and possibly helpless. What would she do without a corner of her own if Ben could not be looked after? He's going to lose that apartment in the old building too. And we need to find out what's going on in his life. Maybe we should save his son. It's about time. He's not going to admit it himself. But when they start living together, Stacy will realize it, see it for herself. She can't leave her only child alone with his troubles and problems. Why are you so worried? Stacy smiled at Edward. It was a sad smile. The woman understood, even without the mirror. I'm not moving to the moon or even to another continent. The city's close by. Distance is no barrier to feelings. Shall we meet, socialize? Of course, Edward sighed. But it's not the same thing, you know, it's just the way life works. Stacy moved to LA and was eager to get settled into her new place. There was only one room in the apartment. It went to Ben, of course. Stacy took the kitchen. She bought herself a cot, which she put by the window at night and put away in the closet in the morning. Edward came often at first. They walked along the promenade, as they had before, and sat in cafes. With him, Stacy felt invaluable, important, loved, not like at home. Edward had urged her to move in with him. But if you don't want to move in with me, let's go somewhere else, he suggested. Svetlana moved to the city to be near her son Matvey and to help him. She soon discovered that Matvey had a serious problem with alcoholism. He was drinking a lot, coming home late at night or in the morning. At first, Svetlana was very worried about her son, afraid that something would happen to him because of his drinking. But then she got used to his nocturnal strolls. Svetlana began to take care of the drunk Matvey. In the morning, she brought pills, water, cleaned up after him. Matvey's alcoholism progressed. He degenerated, became stupid, aggressive, helpless. Svetlana blamed herself for her son's problems, believing that the absence of a father and Matvey's unknown origin had an impact. She speculated that Matvey's alcoholism could have been passed on genetically. Svetlana fully supported and served her son. She cooked, cleaned, and bought groceries. Matvey did not work anywhere because of his drinking and lived on his mother's full support. In general, a difficult situation is described when an elderly mother is forced to have full custody of her adult alcoholic son, having given up her personal life. The son degenerates, but the mother cannot abandon him. Ben didn't bother to work. After a while, the son started demanding money from Stacy when he didn't have enough to drink. And this happened quite often because the man earned a living by rare casual earnings, which fell out infrequently. His soul demanded alcohol on a regular basis. Stacy, feeling sorry for her son, at first gave him money for pocket money and then tried to stop giving money. But Ben still took money from his relative. Sometimes he quietly took money out of his mother's purse. Sometimes he got his way with threats and rudeness. Stacy felt miserable and confused. Living with her own son had become a nightmare. Ben would yell at his mother, sass her for no reason. He would take her money. Therefore, the woman tried, having received a payment, to immediately make a stock of food for a long time. The adult son has not yet raised his hand on his elderly parent. But looking into Ben's empty, embittered eyes, Stacy realized that the moment was not far off. The only outlet for Stacy was her walks with Edward. He still visited her in town whenever he could. The woman didn't talk about her life. It was embarrassing, hard. She couldn't share this misery with anyone at all. In front of others, Stacy put on the mask of a prosperous and happy woman. One day, Edward told Stacy news that made her heart ache. "I'm moving soon," he said, looking away. "We won't be able to see each other much." Whereto Stacy sighed sadly. The only person she'd felt human lately was Edward, and now it looked like their meetings were about to end. "To the sea, to Nashville," he answered. "With his son's family. You know, I'm having trouble with my lungs. The doctor told me to change the climate or else. But never mind, my son has decided to move with me. My daughter's still thinking about it. But it looks like she's going to do it too. So that's that." "That's too bad," Stacy said sadly. She tried to fight the tears that had come to her eyes. "Stacy, I'm begging you, please come with me. You helped your son solve problems when he was in a difficult situation. He'll figure it out on his own. He's not a little boy anymore, are you? We'll live by the sea." Imagine how happy that would be. "Think about it," Edward said. Stacy realized she wasn't going anywhere. How would she leave Ben? Edward just didn't know anything about Ben's addiction. He didn't know that he hadn't been making any money for a long time. Without his mother, Ben would be lost, completely lost. And how could she enjoy the sea, the sun, and the company of a loving Edward, knowing that her son is dying alone in a distant city? Edward was gone. Stacy took his absence hard. They called each other, texted each other. Of course, Edward sent pictures of beautiful landscapes and beckoned, still calling Stacy, telling her how good it would be together. But the woman felt responsible for the son she'd given birth to, the one she hadn't raised. So she had to be there for him, to help, to support him. Sometimes because of these thoughts the woman felt terrible, but she could not do anything about it. A few more years passed. Stacy had grown old. She probably could have looked better and younger, but not with this life. Ben continued to drink and adamantly refused treatment. He started taking company home, and it was much harder than when Stacy waited nights for her son. These marginal-looking people, women, put-down men, laughed loudly in Ben's room. Drinking, arguing, even fighting sometimes. When Stacy tried to talk some sense into her son, he snapped at her. He stopped seeing his mother as a person at all. And then Kate, Ben's common-law wife, showed up at the apartment. There was no hope that she would have a positive effect on her son. Kate was a drinker herself. While Ben usually didn't touch his mother except when he needed money, Kate clung to her mother-in-law on and off. Eventually, she and Ben had managed to turn Stacy against her. He was now convinced that his mother intended to break him up with his beloved and hated Kate. Scolding, quarrels, scandals, all this now waited for Stacy every day. And she hadn't saved her son. She hadn't built a personal happiness with Edward. She could be living with a man who'd loved her all her life on the beach. Dreams, that's all. What about Ben, without her supervision? No, she gave a man life, so she must be responsible for him. Well, I guess that's her fate now. The rain had eased off considerably. Stacy took advantage of the respite to make her way to the driveway. This time she was in a hurry, in case it rained again. She was delaying her return, too, because there was nowhere else to go. It looked like Kate and Ben were having company again tonight. We'd be out till morning in the only room they had. They'll be in the kitchen, of course, going to the fridge. Stacy just filled it with groceries. That's a good thing. We'll probably have to go to the store again tomorrow, if there's any money left. Stacy would lie on her cot all night, pretending to sleep, listening to the sounds of the party in the next room. Her main task now is not to disturb her son, Kate, and their guests. Going up to her floor on foot, there had never been an elevator in this old house. The elderly woman stopped, all the doors as dug in. On the landing stood her suitcases, the same one she had moved here from the village with. Stacy opened one of them. Her belongings lay there. Nothing made sense. The woman tried to open the door with her key. It didn't work. Someone had clicked the lock so it wouldn't unlock from the outside. So Stacy knocked loudly. Their bell hadn't worked in a long time. The door swung open. A happy Kate stood on the doorstep, hands at her sides, feet shoulder-width apart. She was smiling strangely. "What's the matter?" Stacy asked. "Seriously, you old hag," Kate said in a luscious voice. "This is my apartment. Why on earth would I leave? It's not yours, it's Ben's. It's in his name. I saw the paperwork myself the other day. You're nobody here." "Then get out of here," Stacy said. Ben's head peeked out from behind Kate. "Yeah, that's what we've decided. You need to go. You don't give us a life, you're always giving us advice," Ben said. "You mind your own business. Are you trying to break Kate up with me too? We'd better live separately." "What are you going to live on?" Stacy didn't understand. She'd long ago realized that her son had no warm feelings for her, but he needed his mother at least as a source of funding. "You don't know anything, do you?" Kate smirked. "I'm expecting a baby in a couple months. I've already got sick pay, maternity pay. And then every month for the child will be paid, so we're doing great." Stacy glanced at her sister-in-law's figure. Yes, her belly was showing under the sweater, but Kate had never been particularly slender, so the woman didn't notice anything. That's news to her. Ben and Kate are having a baby. Poor baby. What's it like growing up with parents like that? And will that baby ever survive? Stacy's eyes darkened at the news. The news of the baby eclipsed even the fact that she was being kicked out of her own home. She felt unbearably sorry for this unborn baby, grandson or granddaughter. At the same time, the woman realized that she was unable to save him, to make his life even a little easier. It would be better to deal with her own fate. "So get out of here," Kate smiled again. "Son? But where am I supposed to go?" Stacy turned to Ben. "You can't live on the streets. You've got a boyfriend in the village. Go to him." Ben said nonchalantly, "Do you have somewhere else to go?" I don't understand. Ben didn't know that Edward had moved to another state from where he'd never been interested in his mother's affairs. And you have a rich sister who won't leave you, Kate added and slammed the door shut. Stacy picked up her suitcases and went outside. What else could she do? There wasn't a single thought in her head about where to go. Edward was far away. Vivi's sister was even farther away. No one wanted her. Lonely, abandoned, now homeless. She must have deserved it somehow. She's ashamed to even tell the people she knows how life turned out. Her own son, for whom Stacy's mother lived, kicked her out of the house. Out of the house. The rain had stopped, but the icy wind had picked up. It burned his cheeks and made his eyes water. It was rapidly getting darker. There were hardly any people on the streets anymore. Stacy was finally exhausted. She set her suitcases down at an empty bus stop, sat on them, and let the tears flow. They poured down her cheeks, and the woman didn't even wipe her face. She wept for her unfulfilled hopes for her son, sobbed for the plight of Ben and her unborn grandson. But their own future, of course, was a source of anxiety and apprehension. Where to go, from whom to ask for help. Staying outdoors on a cold November night was a pleasure, and something would happen. A pleasant young girl's voice came from somewhere behind her. Stacy turned around. A young woman was looking at her. Tall, thin, tight jeans, sneakers, a deep hooded sweatshirt, and eyes. Attentive, sympathetic eyes. Next to the stranger, a small, funny little dog worried, and seemed to look at Stacy with sympathy too. His funny face looked so funny that the older woman couldn't help but smile through her tears. DG was born into a student family. Her mom was an economist, her dad an engineer. The young parents met at a student disco. They noticed each other right away, fell in love, got married. Digi was born when both were in their 4th year, each at his own university. The young family was not discouraged. Yes, they didn't earn much yet. Yes, they had to live with their child in a cramped room in the student dormitory. But the couple had so much ahead of them. They dreamed, they planned, they hoped. Digi did not remember her parents at all. She saw their photos, listened to the stories of relatives and acquaintances about these people. And then the image of her mother and father opened up in Digi's mind. Cheerful, energetic, hardworking, a little naive, loving each other and the child. Tragedy struck at a construction site. Digi's mom and dad, trying to earn an extra penny after their studies and main job, were looking for a part-time job. And that time they managed to get a job with a private contractor who was building a sports complex in the city center. The young couple, along with a couple of similar students, were painting the walls. And something happened. Either the cable broke or the platform failed. In general, all 4 of them fell from a height right onto the concrete floor. No one survived. There was no chance. The owner of the construction site managed to get away with it. The students worked for him unofficially. He made it look as if the young people had sneaked into his construction site to take extreme photos or something. A friend of her parents, the family's dormitory neighbor, was babysitting little Digi at the time. The girl spent a few days with her. Then she was supposed to be taken to an orphanage. But her father's sister, Aunt Laura, showed up. She lived in the village, raising her 3 children alone. She wasn't poor, but she wasn't wealthy either. Her family couldn't be called a family. An extra mouth in the form of a niece orphaned overnight was a burden to Aunt Laura. But where to go? What would people say? She abandoned her brother's daughter, sent the child to an orphanage. The neighbors will stigmatize her. They'll remember it for the rest of their lives. That's how Digi ended up in Aunt Laura's family. The girl's childhood was, at first glance, the most ordinary. Digi helped her aunt with the household chores, played outside with her children, and went to school with her friends. But no birthdays with a lot of friends and a cake with candles, no new beautiful dresses, no trips to the amusement park. And no dresses. Digi missed the warmth of the world. Hugs, affectionate words, support. Aunt Laura wasn't strict or mean, but she was not in a hurry to surround her niece with love and care. Aunt Laura had a completely different attitude to her own children. She stroked their heads, hugged them, and found tender words for them. Digi always felt like a stranger to her aunt. She realized that she grew up with the realization of her own unwantedness, and it was a heavy burden for Aunt Laura. Sometimes Digi even felt sorry for her aunt. She was so tired with her work and her own children. And now she had a niece to take care of. DG dreamed of growing up and having a family of her own. There she would be loved and appreciated. She had always spent a lot of time studying. First, she liked to learn new things, and the girl was quite good at it. She was an excellent student all the years. Secondly, DG perfectly understood that education is her only chance for a prosperous life. The girl wanted to leave the village, settle in the city, travel the world. For all this, she needed money. So she did her best. After school, DG entered the university as a translator. She was given a dormitory, and her life of freedom began. Finally, she was no longer a burden to anyone. DG didn't even pay attention to guys when she was young. She firmly decided for herself first her career, then everything else. But in her last year of high school, she accidentally met Eugene. He was 8 years older. A well-established, self-confident, handsome, intelligent man came to the university to talk to the rector. Eugene had his own travel agency, and he needed intelligent interpreters. They bumped into each other outside the rector's office. Literally collided. Eugene swung the door open, took a step into the hallway, and crashed into DG, who was walking by. The man immediately picked the girl up, preventing her from falling, and began to apologize. DG assured him with a smile that she was fine. She was amused by the man's consternation. He acted as if he hadn't accidentally hit her with his shoulder, but had almost hit her with a car. And then, like a corny scene from a novel, their eyes met, and DG caught her breath. Eugene seemed to feel something too. There was a spark between the young men. Anyway, they went to the window and talked for a long time. They exchanged phone numbers, of course. And in the evening, he picked up DG, and they went for a walk around the city. The girl herself chose such a format of the first date. DG and Eugene's relationship quickly became close and very serious. Soon the girl moved in with him in a spacious 2-bedroom apartment in the city center. At first, DG was frightened and confused by the fact that her chosen one is so rich he has his own travel agency, a beautiful car, an expensive apartment. And what is she? A girl from the village, penniless. She doesn't even have parents. An orphan from Kazan, but Eugene was not embarrassed by all this. He looked at DG with admiring eyes, showered her with gifts and compliments. The girl saw that her presence made him happy and finally allowed herself to just be happy and not worry about anything. After a while, DG realized she was expecting a baby. Confused, of course. It was too quick and unplanned. Eugene, on the other hand, was genuinely happy. His business was booming. The capital was increasing. The business was growing. Children are happiness, the man smiled, stroking DG's still quite flat belly. DG had thought that Eugene would finally propose to her after the news of her pregnancy, but he was in no hurry to take her to the registry office. When she herself asked him about it when they would legalize the relationship, Eugene was genuinely surprised. What for? Well, as the child should have a full family mom, dad. And this child I will recognize legally, do not doubt. And a stamp in the passport, these are such conventions. You know I was married. And the relationship was ruined after I went to the registry office. Then there was so much trouble with the reissuance of documents and so on. So I'm against such conventions. The words of her beloved then shook DG, but she coped with herself and accepted Eugene's point of view. Really, does it matter if there is a stamp in the passport? What mattered was that they loved each other. Darcy was born on her due date and made DG the happiest person on earth. The young mother couldn't get enough of her daughter and couldn't believe where such a miracle had come from. Eugene was not a very attentive father. He had been distant since the birth of the child. Only DG, blinded by the newfound happiness of motherhood, hadn't noticed it right away. One day, when Darcy was just 2 years old, the man announced, I'm leaving the apartment to my daughter. I'm going to support her for the rest of her life, and I'm going to keep in touch with the baby too. But I can't live with you anymore. Sorry, I fell out of love, met someone else. It happens. Eugene walked away, leaving DG feeling upset. She felt like half her heart had been ripped out of her chest. She'd loved Eugene so much, she'd hoped they'd be okay. She had to adjust to the new reality. Eugene hadn't lied, he'd kept his daughter's apartment and was faithfully paying her alimony. But DG knew she needed to find a source of income. Eugene's money was only for her daughter. DG needed to work. She needed to establish herself in her profession. As practice had shown, in this life you have to rely only on yourself. Digi realized that, in general, she was still very lucky. Eugene left his daughter an apartment and pays child support. It wasn't much, but it was still money. Still, the pain of the breakup lingered in her chest, and the future looked very dim. I had to get a job. But it so happened that Digi had given birth to a daughter right after the university, so she had no time to get a job. And now, with a small child in her arms and no experience, who needs her? Digi has no relatives, no mom, no sister, no grandmother. No one to look after Darcy while her mother is at work. Send her to daycare. But Darcy would get sick a lot there. An employer wouldn't like an employee who couldn't get enough of sick days. The situation appeared to be a stalemate. That November evening, Digi was contemplating her future. Digi was wondering how she would ever get a job again. Money was tight, and she had to deny herself everything. She couldn't, and wouldn't ask Eugene for more money. He had left them a whole apartment and gave them money to support their daughter. And if Digi couldn't provide for herself, that was her problem. After all, she's an adult, not a child. At that moment, Princess Mopisico, the dog Eugene had given to Digi when everything was still good with them, asked to go outside. What bad timing. It's dark and cold, and there are puddles all around. It rained a while ago, but where can we go? Princess can't wait. Darcy is already asleep in her room. She won't wake until morning, so Digi can calmly walk the dog. The girl quickly dressed, attached the collar and leash to Princess and went out into the November evening. Digi noticed the old woman sitting on a suitcase near the bus stop and couldn't believe her eyes. It was too strange. When she got closer, she realized that the old woman was very upset about something. She was crying quietly, not even noticing that her face was already wet with tears. Digi's heart squeezed with pity for a stranger who was obviously in great distress. "What's wrong? Do you need help?" she asked. When Digi heard Stacy's story, she was horrified. She had longed for a mother, for a close family member. She couldn't imagine how Ben could do this to her mom, her own mom. Digi hadn't hesitated for a second in making that offer. The words came out of her mouth before she could think them through. "Let's go to my place now. You're very cold. You need a mug of hot tea. You can't stay outside." A year had passed since that meeting. Stacy had gone to live with Digi. On that cold, dark evening over a cup of hot tea, a solution took shape that suited both parties to the unusual story. Stacy now looked after the house and enjoyed spending time with little Darcy, who loved her new grandmother. Digi went to work knowing that her daughter was in safe and loving hands. Digi finally had someone to love and care for her Stacy. And she was getting the maternal warmth she had missed all her life. And her daughter had a wonderful grandmother who would entertain, feed, and teach. Ben showed up. One day he found out somehow where his mother lived. He demanded Stacy come home, appealed to her sense of family. "Do you value strangers more than your own son?" It happened. Stacy shook her head. "I know that now. Sometimes strangers are closer than family. And I'm not strangers with Digi anymore." Ben kicked Kate out. Their baby was never born. Kate, being pregnant, wasn't about to give up her bad habits. Naturally, her body couldn't take it one day. The baby was born prematurely. It was a very weak and sickly boy. He did not survive. The poor baby's parents' plans for a government welfare check fell through. So Ben came crawling back to his mother. He needed her money again. He still didn't want to work. But this time Stacy was firm. No. Edward was right. Her son was a grown man. She'd done more than she could for him. She'd sold her only home so he could buy an apartment in the city and pay off his debts. Let him take it from there. Speaking of Edward, Stacy told him her story after all. She'd gotten over herself. It made her feel better, and Edward finally understood her. He went to Stacy's house, met Digi and Darcy. The four of them had hit it off. It was a nice, warm group of people. Darcy even started calling Edward grandfather. He didn't mind. On the contrary, he seemed to enjoy it. Before Edward left, he invited her over. "I look forward to seeing all three of you this summer. No refusal." "No refusal is planned." Stacy smiled. Edward was gone. "Summer is coming. DG and Stacy are making plans for a wonderful vacation in Miami. Edward and his whole family are waiting for them. It's going to be a wonderful vacation. And who knows, maybe they'll move to Florida for the vacation and see what's what. DG will try to get a job and take a vacation and get to know the place. They could do it. Why? Living by the ocean surrounded by people you love and love you. Isn't that happiness?